I had been looking forward to that trip for months. Work had been grinding me down in ways I couldn't explain to anyone, and I felt like I needed to get away from everything familiar. I found a small cabin listed for rent at the edge of a forest in the northern part of the state. It wasn't advertised much, which I liked because it meant fewer people knew about it. The cabin was old but decent looking, tucked away by a dirt road that wound through trees so thick that light barely touched the ground. I wanted peace and silence, time to sit still, and space to think. I thought that's all I would get. I didn't expect the isolation to turn into something else, something I wasn't ready for. The cabin sat on a clearing maybe 40 yards wide. Beyond that, walls of trees pushed in from every side. Pines, oaks, and brush filled the area so thick that walking through them was more like pushing against a living wall. The cabin itself was built from logs, with a sloped roof and a small porch that faced the tree line. Out back there was a shed, leaning slightly, with a rusted padlock hanging from its door. I never bothered to check it at first because I didn't need anything from it. The cabin had a single bedroom, a small kitchen with an old propane stove, a wood stove for heat, and a bathroom hooked to a septic tank. It wasn't modern or fancy, but I didn't come for comfort. I came for quiet. The first night felt almost too quiet. I sat on the porch after unloading my things, watching the woods darken. The air cooled quickly, and soon all I could hear were insects buzzing and the occasional call of an owl somewhere far back in the trees. I felt content in that moment, like I had finally broken away from the endless background noise of the city. By midnight, I was in bed, the windows cracked slightly, the sound of the woods slipping in with the night breeze. It was around 3 in the morning when I woke up, not sure why. It wasn't the creaks of the cabin settling or the sounds of the forest. It was different, a sharp noise, like something snapping. I stayed still, waiting, listening. I told myself it was just a branch falling. The woods were full of dead limbs that cracked under their own weight. I rolled over and forced myself back to sleep, but that sound stayed in my head. The next day, I went out to walk around the property to get a feel for how far the land stretched. The rental listing had said the owner's property line went a few hundred yards into the trees. I wandered past the clearing, crunching through underbrush and stepping over roots. The forest felt endless. After about 10 minutes, I stopped, realizing how quickly the trees closed around me. The air was still, the only sound being the faint rustle of leaves. That's when I noticed something strange. About 50 yards in, hidden behind a cluster of trees, was a small path. It looked narrow, beaten down just enough to show someone had walked there often. It wasn't marked, and it didn't look like an animal trail. It looked deliberate. I hesitated before walking down it, but curiosity got the better of me. The path cut through the woods in a straight line, winding slightly but staying narrow, as if whoever used it knew exactly where they were going. I followed it for maybe 100 yards before it stopped at a tree that had been cut, its stump flat and clean. It wasn't freshly cut, but the shape was too even to be natural. I stood there for a while, uneasy. Then I turned back toward the cabin. That night, I sat on the porch again. The woods were darker now, almost suffocating, but I stayed put, listening to the faint hum of insects. Around 10, I heard it again, the snap, but this time it wasn't far. It came from the tree line at the edge of the clearing, sharp and sudden, like someone stepping on a branch. My chest tightened. I stared at the trees, my eyes adjusting to the dark. Nothing moved. I waited, straining to hear anything else. A few minutes later, I went inside and locked the door. I didn't sleep well that night. Every sound kept me awake. The wind, the branches rubbing, even the sound of squirrels on the roof. By morning, I felt drained. I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and told myself I was overreacting. The woods are full of noises, and I wasn't used to being in such isolation. I tried to laugh at myself. Later that day, I checked out the shed behind the cabin. The padlock was old but not locked, just hooked through the latch. Inside was clutter, rusty tools, a broken ladder, old gas cans. On the floor, against the wall, I noticed boot prints in the dust. They didn't look fresh, but they were clear. Someone had been in there before. I stepped back, shut the door, and told myself it was the owners. It had to be. The third night is when it became harder to explain. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard footsteps outside. Slow, steady crunches moving across the clearing. My body stiffened. They weren't animal sounds. They were heavy, spaced apart like a person walking. I held my breath, waiting for them to pass, but instead, they stopped right outside the cabin. My skin went cold. I stared at the ceiling, my heart pounding so loud I thought it would give me away. Minutes passed. Nothing. Just silence. I didn't dare move. Eventually, I must have dozed off from exhaustion because the next thing I remember was waking to daylight bleeding through the curtains. I went outside immediately, scanning the ground. The dew on the grass made it clear. There were prints. Human prints. Boots. They came from the trees, circled near the porch, and then went back into the woods. I crouched, staring at them, my mouth dry. Someone had been there. Someone had stood outside my cabin in the middle of the night. My mind scrambled for explanations. A hunter, a hiker, maybe someone just wandering. But why come so close? Why circle the cabin? That day I stayed close to the cabin. I kept the door locked, even during the afternoon. I walked the perimeter of the clearing, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. I saw nothing, but the unease grew heavier with every passing hour. That night I didn't sleep. I sat inside with the lights off, staring out the window toward the clearing. Around midnight I heard it again, the crunch of footsteps. My stomach twisted. This time they didn't circle. They stopped right at the porch. I sat frozen, every muscle locked in place. I could hear the faint creak of the wooden steps outside, as if weight had been placed on them. Whoever it was, they were standing just feet away. I waited, my hands trembling. After what felt like forever, the sounds faded. Whoever it was walked back into the trees. I didn't move until the sky turned gray with dawn. The next morning, I packed my bag. I had enough. I told myself I would drive back, even if it meant wasting the rest of the week. But when I got to my car, something was wrong. The driver's side door handle was scratched, deep gouges in the paint. I tried the door. It was locked, but when I pulled the handle, it stuck, almost like it had been jammed. My keys still opened it, but the sight of those scratches filled me with a cold certainty. Someone had tried to get in. I started the engine, ready to leave, but then I stopped. The dirt road leading away from the cabin looked narrower than I remembered. The thought hit me, what if someone was out there waiting? The road was tight with no room to turn around. If someone blocked it, I'd be trapped. My stomach knotted. I shut the car off and went back inside. I thought maybe I was being paranoid, but deep down I knew I wasn't. That day dragged. I barely ate. I sat by the window watching the tree line. Every movement of branches made me tense. The woods no longer felt quiet. They felt alive, like they were watching me. When night fell, I tried to prepare myself. I set a chair under the door handle, even though I knew it wouldn't do much. I grabbed the heaviest tool I had found in the shed, a rusted hammer, and kept it next to me. I sat in the dark, waiting. It was past 1 in the morning when it started. Not footsteps this time. Breathing. Slow, heavy breathing outside the window. My blood froze. It was so close I could hear the rasp of air in and out. My hands shook so bad the hammer almost slipped from my grip. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The breathing went on for what felt like minutes. Then it stopped. Silence. I sat there the rest of the night, never moving, never daring to sleep. By morning, I had made up my mind. I couldn't stay another night. I didn't care if the road was blocked. I would drive through if I had to. I grabbed my bag, locked the cabin behind me, and got in the car. The dirt road stretched out ahead, winding between the trees. I gripped the wheel tight and drove. For the first mile, nothing happened. My eyes darted left and right, scanning the trees, waiting for movement. Then, halfway down the road, I saw it. A figure, standing in the trees just off the road. Not moving, just standing there watching as I passed. I didn't slow down. I didn't look back. I kept driving until the trees thinned and the paved road came into view. When I finally reached the highway, my chest loosened for the first time in days. I drove without stopping until I was back in the city. I had been looking forward to some time away from everything for months. Life in the city had gotten too loud and too fast, and I felt like I was losing track of myself with all the noise and routine. I found an old cabin listed for rent deep in the woods, about 4 hours away from town. It was small, simple, and cut off from most people. The ad had said there was no Wi-Fi, no television, and barely any phone reception, but that was exactly what I wanted. I thought the quiet would help me rest. I packed a few days' worth of food, some clothes, and enough water and small supplies to last comfortably. My plan was to stay alone, read, write a little, and just enjoy the silence. The drive out there was long, with the road narrowing the deeper I went into the forest. The last part was nothing but a dirt path that twisted through thick trees, and it felt like I was leaving everything behind. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was dipping low and the sky had that dull orange glow that comes before dusk. The cabin itself looked older than I expected, built from rough logs with a tin roof that had rust at the edges. The porch had a few loose boards, and the windows were simple, with thin curtains. It stood in a small clearing with trees packed tight around it. Behind it, the woods went on endlessly. Inside, it smelled like dust and old wood. The place had one main room with a small table, a couple of chairs, a couch pushed against the wall, and a stone fireplace that hadn't been used in a long time. Off to the side was a tiny kitchen area with a counter and an old gas stove. A short hallway led to one bedroom and a small bathroom. It wasn't much, but it had a certain charm. I felt like I was alone in the world, cut off from everything, and for the first time in a long while, I felt calm. The first night passed quietly. I lit a few candles and set up the lantern I had brought. Outside, the woods were completely dark, so black it was like the trees swallowed all the light. I couldn't see more than a few feet past the porch. Every now and then, I heard an owl or the rustle of something moving through the leaves, but it didn't bother me. That was just nature. I slept lightly, but nothing felt wrong. I thought I was going to have the peaceful trip I had planned. The next day, I spent walking around the clearing, stretching my legs after the long drive. The air was sharp and cool, and the ground was covered in dead leaves that crunched under my boots. I didn't see any other people, no cars, not even signs of hikers. It really felt like no one was around for miles. That was what I wanted. I spent the afternoon inside reading and writing in a notebook. The cabin was quiet except for the creaks of the wood and the occasional pop of the roof in the sun. I thought about how good it felt to be away from everything. That night, though, something felt different. It started small. I was sitting on the couch with the lantern burning low when I thought I heard something outside. At first, I brushed it off as an animal, maybe a deer moving through the woods. But then I heard what sounded like a footstep on the porch. Just one, then nothing. My chest tightened. I sat still and listened, holding my breath, waiting. For a long minute, there was nothing but silence. Then I heard it again. A slow, heavy step, like someone putting weight on the old wood. The porch creaked the way it had when I walked on it earlier. My skin prickled all over. I turned off the lantern so I wouldn't be glowing like a target inside the cabin. I sat in the dark with my back pressed against the couch, my ears straining. The steps came again, a few in a row this time, moving slowly across the porch. Then they stopped right in front of the window. The thin curtains moved slightly, as if air shifted when someone brushed against them. I stayed frozen, barely breathing. After what felt like forever, the sound stopped. I didn't hear footsteps walking away. I didn't hear the porch creak again. Just silence. I waited for almost an hour, not daring to move. Finally, I convinced myself it had to have been my imagination, or maybe an animal heavier than I thought. I didn't sleep well that night. Every sound made me flinch. The next morning, I forced myself to check outside. The porch boards had fresh scuff marks near the window. They were long and uneven, not like the round prints of an animal. They looked like shoe marks, the kind someone would leave when turning their feet slightly as they stood. My stomach sank. Someone had been out there. I walked the edge of the clearing, scanning the ground. In the soft dirt near the tree line, I found a faint shoe print. It was human. I couldn't tell how fresh it was, but it was big, bigger than my own. That meant someone had come close to the cabin during the night. Maybe they were curious, maybe they were lost, but they hadn't knocked on the door. They hadn't called out. They just stood there watching. The day dragged on with a constant edge of unease. Every creak of the cabin made me look up. Every sound outside made me stiffen. I kept telling myself it was nothing, that I was safe, that no one would bother coming this deep into the woods. But deep down I knew someone had been there. When night came again, I was already on edge. I locked the door, checked the windows twice, and sat in the dark with the lantern off. Around midnight, I heard it again. Slow steps on the porch. This time, there was no doubt. Someone was outside. I held still, heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The steps moved to the window, stopped, then shifted toward the door. The handle rattled softly. Someone was testing it. My whole body went cold. I grabbed the small hatchet I had brought for chopping firewood and held it tight. The door rattled again, harder this time, but the lock held. Then came silence. For long minutes, I waited, every muscle tense, gripping the hatchet so tight my hands hurt. Finally, I heard the steps retreat slowly across the porch. Then nothing. I didn't sleep at all that night. When morning came, I checked the porch again. The dirt near the steps had fresh prints. Someone had definitely been there, right at my door. They knew I was inside. They didn't try to talk or explain themselves. They just tested the lock and left. By then, my food and supplies were still enough to last, but my nerves were shot. I thought about leaving, but the dirt road was rough and I worried about driving it in the dark if the person came back. I told myself maybe it was over, maybe they had just been curious and had gone. But the third night was worse. I stayed awake, sitting on the floor with my back against the wall, the hatchet across my lap. Hours passed in silence, and I almost thought I had worried for nothing. Then I heard the faint crunch of leaves outside. Whoever it was had come back. The steps were slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. I could hear them moving from one window to the next, pausing at each one. The thin curtains shifted as if someone's face was almost pressed against the glass. Then the doorknob rattled again, harder this time. The lock strained, but held. I gripped the hatchet so tight my arms ached. The rattling stopped, and I heard the sound of wood splintering near the back. They were trying the rear door. I moved quickly but quietly through the cabin, every floorboard threatening to give me away. The back door shuddered, but the old wood held. For hours, they circled the cabin, testing the windows, pressing against the doors, walking slowly on the porch. Sometimes I heard them breathing faintly near the glass. Every hair on my body stood on end. They never said a word. They never left. They just circled like a predator waiting for a mistake. When dawn finally broke, the sound stopped. I waited, terrified, until the sun was fully up before I dared look outside. Fresh footprints circled the cabin completely. Some prints stopped right in front of the windows, as if they had stood there for a long time, watching. That was the moment I knew I couldn't stay. I gathered my things quickly, stuffing everything into bags. I loaded the car with shaking hands, glancing over my shoulder at the tree line. I felt watched even in daylight. The drive back down the dirt road was slow and tense. Every bend in the trees felt like a place someone could be waiting. My eyes flicked to the rearview mirror again and again, half expecting to see a figure following. I didn't relax until I reached the paved road miles away. I never told anyone the full story after I left. I just said the cabin was too quiet, too lonely. But I knew the truth. Someone had been out there, night after night, circling me in the dark, testing the doors, watching me through the thin curtains. They hadn't tried to talk. They hadn't left when I stayed inside. They wanted in. If I had stayed one more night, I don't know if the doors or windows would have held. I don't know if I would be alive to tell this now. I had decided to spend a few days at a small cabin deep in the woods, away from town, away from people, away from noise. The cabin was not mine. It belonged to a friend of a relative who rarely used it anymore. I thought it would be the perfect place to clear my head, breathe fresh air, and just be away from everything for a while. It was early fall and the leaves had already started changing, so the woods around the place looked beautiful but also strangely quiet. I arrived in the late afternoon, parked my car by the edge of the dirt road that led up to the clearing, and carried my bag and a few supplies inside. The cabin was simple, old, and a little worn down. The wood siding looked gray from years of weather, and the roof sagged slightly in the middle, but it was still sturdy. Inside there was one small room with a fireplace, an old couch, a wooden table, and a bed tucked against the far wall. The floor creaked under my boots, and I noticed dust on some of the shelves, but it didn't bother me. I had brought enough food for a few days, bottled water, and a small cooler with ice. My plan was to read, write in my notebook, and maybe walk some trails. By the time I settled in, the sun was going down, and the light that came through the single window turned orange. I lit a lantern and placed it on the table. The woods outside were already darkening, and I could see the tree line pressing close around the cabin. I ate a sandwich, sat for a while just listening to the crickets, then lay on the bed to rest. I remember thinking it felt too quiet. At first, I liked it, but the longer I sat there, the more the silence felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me. That first night, I woke up around 2 a.m. I wasn't sure what woke me, but I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling. The only sound was the occasional creak of the wood as the cabin cooled. I turned over and tried to fall back asleep, but then I thought I heard something faint outside, almost like a crunch in the leaves. I held my breath and listened. Nothing came after it, and I told myself it was probably a raccoon or a deer. Still, I felt a tension in my chest that made it hard to sleep. I lay awake until dawn started showing through the window. The next day, I tried to shake off the unease. I went for a short walk down one of the trails. The air was cool, and the forest smelled like damp leaves and pine. I noticed how thick the woods were. The trees grew close together, and the brush was dense. I could barely see 20 feet in some directions. At one point, I found an old fire ring, blackened stones in a circle, like someone had camped there years ago. It looked abandoned, but I couldn't help thinking of people being there before me, sitting around a fire in the dark. Back at the cabin, I spent the day reading and writing. The stillness returned as the sun dropped lower, and I felt uneasy again as shadows grew long across the clearing. I tried to ignore it, cooked a simple meal on the small propane stove I had brought, and tried to distract myself. But as soon as night fell, the feeling came back stronger than before. I kept glancing at the window, half expecting to see something moving in the dark. That night, sleep was harder to come by. Around midnight, I thought I heard something outside again. This time, it was not just a single crunch. It was a faint but steady sound, like someone moving slowly through leaves. I sat up in bed and listened hard. The sound stopped. I waited for a long time, staring at the door, then eventually lay back down, but I barely slept at all. By the third day, I was more tired than relaxed. My nerves were frayed, and every little noise set me on edge. The woods seemed different now, less calm, more watchful. While walking the trail again, I found something that unsettled me. About 100 feet off the path, I saw what looked like a torn piece of fabric caught on a low branch. It was faded blue, maybe from a shirt or jacket. I walked over and pulled it free. It looked old, frayed at the edges, but it still made me uneasy. Why would it be out here? I dropped it and walked back quickly, feeling like eyes were on me. That evening, the wind picked up, and the woods outside hissed with moving leaves. The sound made me restless. I couldn't stop pacing the cabin. When it got dark, I lit the lantern, but it only made the shadows stretch further into the corners. Around 9 p.m., I heard it again, the crunching sound outside, closer this time. I froze, every hair on my arms standing up. It was slow, deliberate, not the random sound of an animal. It was footsteps. I sat perfectly still, staring at the door. My heart hammered so hard I could hear the blood in my ears. The sound circled the cabin, crunching leaves, then stopping. Silence. Then another slow crunch. It sounded like someone was moving just beyond the walls, slow enough that I could follow each step. I didn't move, didn't breathe, After what felt like an hour but was probably only minutes, the sound faded into the distance. I sat there frozen until the lantern burned low. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I walked the perimeter of the cabin. The ground was covered in leaves, but I thought I saw impressions where something heavy had pressed down. Not clear footprints, but enough to make me uneasy. I considered leaving, but something in me argued that I was imagining things, that I was overreacting, that I needed to prove to myself I wasn't scared. So I stayed. But that night it got worse. The sound came again, but louder, closer, circling slower. I could hear it pause as if listening. Once, I thought I heard the faint creak of wood on the porch outside. My throat went dry, and I stared at the door until my eyes ached. Every instinct in me screamed to grab my bag, run to the car, and drive away, but I couldn't move. I just sat, locked in fear, until eventually the sound drifted off into the woods again. When daylight came, I knew I couldn't last another night. I started packing my things, stuffing clothes into my bag, trying to calm my shaking hands. But when I stepped outside, I noticed something on the porch. Near the door, in the thin layer of dust, there was a mark. It wasn't a boot print, not clear enough, but it was a smear like something had been dragged lightly across the wood. My stomach turned. Someone had been right there. I shoved my bag in the car, started the engine, and drove down the dirt road as fast as I dared. I didn't look back at the cabin, not once. The woods closed in on both sides, and I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone step into the road behind me. My chest felt tight the whole drive until I finally saw the main road ahead. When I reached town, I stopped at a gas station. I sat in the car for a long time, breathing hard, staring at the people walking in and out like everything was normal. I thought about telling someone, but what would I say? That I heard footsteps in the woods? That I saw a mark on the porch? No one would believe me, and maybe they were right. Maybe it was just animals, wind, or my imagination. But I knew deep down it wasn't. Someone had been there. Someone had been walking around the cabin at night, circling it, watching, waiting. I left and never went back. The cabin still stands, but I won't ever set foot in it again. I don't need proof. I felt it, I heard it, I lived it, and I know I was not alone out there. I drove up the mountain road later than I had planned. The sun was already dropping behind the trees, and the shadows stretched longer and darker across the narrow path. My car felt small on that old road, with sharp turns and steep drop-offs on one side. I kept glancing at the fuel gauge, even though I had filled the tank earlier. The road was rough, and every pothole shook the steering wheel. I hadn't been to this cabin in years, but I remembered how isolated it was. That was the reason I chose it again. I wanted quiet. I wanted space to clear my head. When I finally pulled up, the cabin looked almost hidden by the woods. The roof was dark with age, and the porch sagged a little, but it was still standing. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. I carried my bags inside, the wooden floor creaking under my steps. The cabin was simple. One big room with a small kitchen on one side, a bed pushed against the wall, and a wood stove in the corner. There was no phone service up there, no internet, no neighbors, just me and the silence. I unpacked slowly, checking the cupboards. I had brought enough food for a week, mostly cans and dry goods. There was bottled water too, though I knew the cabin had an old pump outside. I set everything in place and lit a lantern. The light flickered across the wood walls. It felt comforting at first, like stepping back into another time, but the silence pressed hard. Every sound seemed louder than it should be. When I dropped a spoon on the counter, it echoed like a hammer on metal. The first night was uneasy. I lay on the bed listening. The woods outside moved and shifted with life. I heard branches snapping far off, then closer, then the long stretch of silence again. I told myself it was just deer. It was always deer out there. But once in a while, I thought I heard something slower, heavier, like steps. I kept staring at the ceiling, waiting for sleep that didn't want to come. The morning helped. Sunlight came through the thin curtains and made the cabin look less like a trap. I made coffee on the small gas burner I had brought. I stepped out onto the porch, the boards soft under my weight, and breathed in the cold mountain air. It smelled clean. I could see the trees sloping down toward a valley, and a thin line of river glinting far away. No roads, no houses, no sound of people. That was what I came for. I spent the day walking around, trying to get familiar with the land again. The trails weren't really trails anymore, just faint paths through the brush. I carried a knife on my belt, not for show, but because I knew things could go wrong out here. I saw signs of animals, scat, prints in the mud, scratches on the trees. One set of prints made me stop. They were wider than my hand, pressed deep into the soil. Bear. Big one too. I told myself I'd be careful with food, keep it sealed and inside. Back at the cabin, I stacked some wood near the stove and checked the locks. The door was old but solid. The windows had latches. I kept telling myself it was safe enough, but I couldn't shake the thought of those prints. That night, I built a fire in the stove and listened again. The forest was louder in the dark. Something moved out there, sometimes near, sometimes far. Once I thought I heard breathing, slow and rough, just beyond the wall. I sat up in bed, every hair on my body standing. I stayed awake until the fire burned low. The days passed slow. I read the books I had brought, I wrote in a notebook, I walked the woods. But each night grew worse. The noises didn't stop. Sometimes it was scratching, light at first, then heavier, like claws against the wood. Other times it was footsteps, circling, pausing, circling again. I started to feel like I was being watched. In the daylight, I looked for signs. I found tracks near the porch, pressed into the mud. They weren't deer. They weren't bear either. They looked like boots. That was when the fear changed. Animals I could handle. People were worse. The cabin had no lock strong enough to stop someone determined. I checked the door over and over, pressing on it, making sure the latch was set. I shoved a chair under the handle too, just in case. At night, I kept the lantern low and sat up listening. Sometimes I heard nothing, and the silence was worse than noise. Other times I heard twigs snapping, slow steps, and once a sound like a hand sliding across the wall. I sat frozen, gripping the knife. On the fourth night, I heard something different. A thud against the porch, then another. Heavy, slow, deliberate. Not an accident. Not an animal brushing past. My heart pounded so hard I felt it in my throat. I stayed still, the lantern dark, my hands sweaty around the knife. The steps moved across the boards, then stopped right at the door. The wood creaked as weight pressed against it. I waited for the handle to turn, but it never did. After what felt like an hour, the boards eased, the sound fading into the woods. I didn't sleep at all after that. At dawn, I stepped outside, my eyes burning from exhaustion. On the porch were muddy prints, boots, large size, too large for me. I followed them a little way, but they disappeared into the trees. Whoever it was knew how to move through the woods without leaving much behind. That day, I thought about leaving. I even packed some of my things back into the bag. But the nearest town was hours away, and I was already drained. I told myself maybe it was a hunter passing through, maybe just curious. But the prints were too close. They were right on the porch. The next night was worse. I tried to stay awake, but exhaustion pulled at me. I must have drifted off because I woke to the sound of wood splitting. Not the stove. The door. Someone was pushing, testing, forcing. The chair against the handle creaked. I held the knife and stayed low, every muscle shaking. The pressure stopped. Silence. Then the soft crunch of steps moving away again. I waited until morning, my throat dry, my body stiff. When I opened the door, I saw it had been pried at near the latch. Small chips of wood scattered on the floor. Someone had tried to get in. That was the moment I decided I couldn't stay. I packed everything fast, my hands fumbling. I shoved food, clothes, the knife, everything into the bag. I locked the door out of habit, though it felt useless. I started toward the car, my head snapping at every sound. When I reached it, my stomach dropped. Both front tires were flat, cut, not torn, not worn down, sliced clean. I stood frozen, staring at them, the forest pressing in around me. Whoever was out there didn't just want to scare me. They wanted me stuck. I went back to the cabin because I had no choice. I shut the door, slid the chair back under the handle, and sat with the knife. I thought about the pump outside, the wood pile, the little things I might need, but I didn't move. The daylight passed in silence. That night, I heard nothing for hours. It almost fooled me into thinking they were gone. But then came the scrape again. Not at the door this time, but at the window. Slow, long, steady. I turned the lantern out and sat in darkness, my breath shallow. The scraping stopped. Then a tap, light, deliberate on the glass. I stayed frozen until dawn. By morning, I knew what I had to do. I couldn't wait there anymore. The food would run out. The water too. The person outside wasn't leaving. I stuffed the bag again, heavier this time, and slung it on my back. I carried the knife in one hand. I stepped off the porch and didn't look back. I followed the old path down toward the valley. It was rough, overgrown, but I forced my way through. Every sound in the trees made me flinch. I kept looking over my shoulder, certain I would see someone behind me. Hours passed. My legs shook, my throat dry, but I didn't stop. When I finally reached the river, I followed it, knowing it would lead to a road. My body felt hollow from fear and exhaustion, but I kept moving. I didn't see anyone, but I felt them. I felt eyes on me the whole way. By evening, I stumbled onto a dirt road. My knees almost gave out with relief. I walked until a truck came, the driver staring wide-eyed at me as I flagged him down. He let me in, and I didn't look back at the woods. I never went to that cabin again. The thought that stays with me isn't the noises or the footsteps or the window. It's the tires, cut clean, silently, while I sat inside thinking I was safe. That person had been close, so close, and I never heard them. And I still don't know what they wanted. I drove up into the hills late in the afternoon. The sky still bright, but starting to thin into that pale light that comes before sunset. The road twisted higher and higher into the forest, narrow and cracked in places, with long weeds growing in from the edges. My truck was weighed down in the back with gear I had packed for a week away. Food supplies, a few tools, a sleeping bag, lanterns, and extra water. The cabin was old and small, owned by a relative who had let me use it whenever I wanted some time alone. I had been there once before for only a weekend, but this time I wanted to stay longer. The air felt colder as I climbed higher, and the woods on both sides of the road grew thicker. I kept glancing at the fuel gauge, though I had filled the tank earlier that morning. There were no towns or gas stations anywhere nearby once you left the main road. It felt like I was cutting myself off from the rest of the world. That was what I wanted. Some quiet, some distance from everything. But even as I thought that, I noticed a pressure building in my stomach. Something about the way the road narrowed and the trees pressed in made me uneasy, though I told myself it was just because I was alone. When I finally turned onto the dirt track that led to the cabin, the tires crunched over gravel, and branches scraped along the sides of the truck. The track twisted down a slope and then flattened out into a small clearing. There it was, the cabin, sitting at the far edge with the forest pressing close behind it. It was nothing fancy, just a square of dark wood with a porch in front and a slanted roof. The windows looked black from where I sat in the truck. I parked close to the porch and killed the engine. The sudden silence pressed against me harder than I expected. No traffic, no hum of electricity, just the faint creak of trees swaying. I sat for a moment before grabbing my things. The lock on the cabin door was stiff but gave after I pushed the key in hard. Inside, the place smelled of dust and old wood. A small table sat in the middle, a couple of chairs pushed to one side, and a single bed against the wall with a thin mattress. I unpacked slowly, setting food and water on the shelves and placing my sleeping bag on the mattress. The sun had started to slide lower, sending slanted light through the window. Dust floated in the beam, twisting and spinning in silence. I tried to settle in, cooking a quick meal on the small gas burner I had brought, then sat on the porch as the light faded out of the clearing. The forest grew darker by the minute, shadows stretching long across the ground. When night finally fell, it was darker than I remembered from my first visit. I thought I would see the moon between the trees, but heavy clouds rolled in, covering the sky. I switched on my lantern inside the cabin and locked the door. The glow filled the room with weak yellow light. Outside, I could hear the forest, small cracks of twigs, rustles of leaves, something moving here and there, the calls of unseen birds. I told myself it was nothing unusual, but each sound seemed sharper than it should have been. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling beams, listening to every sound outside. At some point, I drifted off, though my sleep was shallow. I woke once in the night to silence so deep it pressed against my ears. I thought I had heard something outside, a faint step or scrape, but when I held my breath and listened harder, there was nothing. Morning came gray and damp. I brewed instant coffee and sat on the porch, trying to shake the feeling from the night before. I kept telling myself I was letting the isolation get to me. I spent the day exploring the area around the cabin, walking into the woods with a small pack and marking my trail with bits of ribbon so I wouldn't lose my way. The forest was dense, the ground soft with pine needles and patches of moss. A few times I thought I saw movement deeper in the trees, but each time it was just a deer leaping away or a squirrel darting across a branch. When I returned to the cabin in the afternoon, I noticed something odd. On the far side of the clearing, in the soft ground near the trees, there were tracks. At first, I thought they were from a deer, but when I stepped closer, I realized they weren't. They were boot prints. The size looked close to mine, maybe a little larger, and they led from the woods toward the clearing but then stopped halfway, as if whoever had made them turned back into the trees. I crouched down, staring at them for a long time. The soil was damp, so the prints looked fresh. I hadn't seen another vehicle or person the entire drive up here. The cabin was far off any main trail. My chest tightened as I stood there, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved. The woods stood silent. I told myself maybe they were old and just looked fresh because of the damp ground, but deep down I didn't believe that. That night, I locked the door again and set the lantern close to the bed. I tried reading from an old book I had brought, but my eyes kept flicking to the windows. At some point, I switched the lantern off to save fuel and let the room go dark. I lay in silence, listening. For a long time, there was nothing. Then I heard it again. Soft, deliberate movement outside. Leaves rustling, a faint crack of wood. My body went rigid. I stayed frozen in my bag, barely breathing. The sound moved slowly around the cabin, stopping now and then, starting again. Whoever it was, they weren't moving quickly. They were moving with care. My heart hammered so loud I thought it might be heard outside. After what felt like forever, the sound faded back into the woods. I did not sleep again that night. In the morning, I forced myself outside. The clearing looked calm, the sun shining down through thin clouds. But when I walked around the cabin, I found more boot prints in the soft dirt near the back wall. They were clearer than before, pressed deep into the ground. Someone had been standing just a few feet from where I had been lying inside. My hands shook as I checked the trees again. The forest gave nothing away, just tall trunks and shadows between them. I thought about leaving right then, packing up and driving down the road. But something in me resisted. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe pride, maybe a simple refusal to believe I was in real danger. I told myself it could be a hunter passing through, someone with no bad intentions. Still, I carried my hatchet with me the rest of the day. By evening, clouds had rolled in again, heavier this time. Thunder rumbled far off. I cooked a quick meal but barely tasted it. The whole time, I kept glancing at the window. I locked the door and placed a chair under the knob, even though I knew the door wasn't strong enough to hold against real force. I sat with the lantern low, the hatchet on my lap, listening as the storm closed in. Rain started to fall, first light, then heavy. The roof drummed with it, and wind pushed against the walls. For a while, the storm almost calmed me. It drowned out other noises, made the night less silent. But then, through the storm, I heard it again. Faint but clear, a step outside. I froze, gripping the hatchet. The sound came again, closer, just outside the wall. My skin prickled all over. Whoever it was had come back, moving even in the storm. The steps circled, slow, steady. At one point, I heard them pause directly outside the door. The chair under the knob shifted slightly, as if the handle had been touched. I waited, muscles burning, not moving, barely breathing. After a long moment, the steps moved again, fading into the storm. I sat there until the lantern burned low, the rain still hammering on the roof. At dawn, when the rain had stopped, I went outside. The ground around the cabin was a mess of prints now, overlapping, circling. Some were pressed so close to the walls I could see where the mud had smeared up the wood. My chest felt hollow as I stood there staring at them. I couldn't pretend anymore this was just chance. Someone was coming back, night after night, walking around the cabin. I made up my mind then. I would leave. I packed quickly, throwing things into the truck bed without care. My hands shook as I shoved the last of it in. I climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and pulled out of the clearing. The forest pressed close on both sides as I followed the track back toward the main road. I glanced into the rearview mirror again and again, half expecting to see someone step into the road behind me. The track twisted and turned, mud slick in places from the storm. At one bend, I slowed, tires slipping slightly. That was when I saw it. A vehicle, an old dark pickup, was parked just off the track ahead, half hidden behind the trees. The driver's side door stood open. I slammed the brakes, my heart hammering. The truck was empty. The forest was silent. I sat there, staring at it, feeling my chest tighten. It wasn't abandoned, it looked used, mud still wet on the tires. I shifted into reverse, backing down the track, the trees closing in. Then I turned the wheel hard and cut across a patch of rough ground, branches scraping against the sides of my truck. I pushed the engine harder than I should have, the road jolting under me. I didn't look back again. When I finally reached the main road, I didn't stop. I kept driving, down through the hills, out of the forest. I had been looking forward to the trip for weeks. The cabin wasn't mine, but a friend of mine had offered it to me for a few days since he knew I wanted some time alone. He said it was deep enough in the woods that I wouldn't hear cars, people, or anything else, but close enough to a trailhead that I could leave whenever I wanted. That balance sounded perfect to me. I wanted to be away from the city noise, away from the routine that kept my head spinning, and just have a few days where I could sit quietly, cook simple meals, read, and maybe hike around. The drive up was long. The paved road ended after about 2 hours. Then came a rough dirt road that wound through tall trees. The forest felt endless, and the deeper I went, the less I felt connected to the outside world. My phone signal had disappeared about 20 minutes earlier, and I knew I wouldn't get it back until I returned to the main road. The road was narrow, sometimes just enough for one vehicle, and there were no houses in sight, no mailboxes, nothing but trees, brush, and the sound of gravel under my tires. When I finally reached the cabin, I saw that it was small but sturdy. A dark brown wooden structure with a metal roof, a stone chimney on one side, and a small porch with 2 steps leading up. It looked like it had been there for decades. There was a clearing around it, maybe 30 feet wide, before the forest closed in again. In front of the cabin was a short gravel patch where I parked the car. Beyond that was nothing but trees and silence. I got out and stretched. The air smelled strong of pine and damp earth. It was cooler than in the city, and the silence was heavy. No hum of traffic, no neighbors, no planes overhead, just the distant chirping of birds and the occasional rustle of leaves. Inside, the cabin was plain. A single main room with a small kitchen space on one side, a table with 2 chairs, a couch facing an old wood stove, and a small hallway that led to a bedroom and bathroom. The floor creaked under my boots. Everything smelled faintly of old wood and dust, but it was clean. My friend had said there was no electricity, only propane lamps, and the water pump outside supplied water for washing and cooking. That was fine with me. I had brought food, matches, extra batteries, and everything I thought I might need. The first few hours were calm. I unpacked, stacked my food neatly, and walked the perimeter of the clearing just to take in the area. The forest was dense. You couldn't see very far before the trees swallowed everything. The brush was thick in places, and there were fallen branches and damp moss on the ground. I thought about hiking deeper the next day, but decided I'd take it easy on the first. That night, after cooking a simple meal of rice and canned beans, I lit a propane lamp and read for a while. Outside, the forest grew dark quickly, and the silence became even heavier, the kind of silence that makes you aware of every small sound. I heard the occasional crack of a branch somewhere outside, the distant call of an owl, and the faint rustle of something moving through the brush. It was normal, I told myself. The woods were alive with animals, rabbits, deer, maybe foxes. I went to bed early, listening to the quiet. The mattress was thin but enough. I pulled a blanket over myself and closed my eyes. Sometime in the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure why. My eyes opened in the darkness, and I lay there listening. The cabin was silent. Then, faintly, I thought I heard something outside, a crunch like a footstep on gravel. I held still, listening harder. Maybe it was just an animal. A deer could have wandered close. But then I heard another sound, slower, deliberate, like weight shifting on the porch. I froze. The cabin had no curtains on the bedroom window, only a thin set of blinds. The porch was right outside that window. I didn't move. My chest felt tight. I listened for what felt like a long time, but the sounds didn't continue. After several minutes of silence, I convinced myself it must have been my half-dreaming mind mixing with the noises of the woods. Maybe a raccoon had climbed the steps. I eventually fell back asleep. The next morning, I stepped outside. The air was damp from a light rain during the night. I looked at the porch. Nothing was out of place. But when I glanced down at the gravel in front of the cabin, I noticed something. A faint mark in the stones, like where weight had pressed down. Not a clear footprint, but not the random scattering of rocks either. It looked like something heavy had stepped there. I stared at it for a long moment. Could have been anything, I told myself. Animals leave strange marks. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. That day, I tried to distract myself. I boiled water from the pump, made oatmeal, and took a short hike up the dirt road. Felt better to be moving, to see the trees in daylight. I found a small stream about 20 minutes away and followed it for a while, but I kept thinking about the sound from the night before. When I got back to the cabin, I decided to check around the clearing more carefully. I walked the edges, scanning the ground. First, I saw nothing unusual. Then, behind the cabin near the tree line, I noticed the ground looked disturbed. Leaves had been pushed aside, and in the soft dirt, there was the faint impression of a shoe. Not an animal's paw, not random. A shoe. The heel and the front shape were clear enough, though rain had blurred it. I crouched there for a long time, staring at it. My stomach sank. Someone had been there, standing at the edge of the trees behind the cabin. Watching, passing through. I didn't know. I told myself it could have been old. Maybe my friend when he was last up here, or someone who had walked by weeks ago. But the dirt looked fresh. The leaves pushed aside hadn't dried or blown back yet. It seemed recent. That night, I felt uneasy. I double-checked the lock on the door, even though it was a simple one. I kept the propane lamp on longer, listening. The forest seemed louder now. Every crack of a branch, every rustle in the brush made me sit up straighter. When I finally turned the lamp off and lay down, it took me a long time to fall asleep. Again, in the middle of the night, I woke up. Faint sound. This time I was sure of it. A slow creak of wood. The porch steps. My chest pounded. I lay perfectly still, my ears straining. Another creak. Then silence. I didn't move. I barely breathed. After what felt like forever, I heard nothing else. In the morning, when I stepped outside, the gravel again seemed disturbed. This time, there was no mistaking it. A clear footprint. A man's boot print, leading from the gravel to the steps. My stomach dropped. I walked the clearing, my eyes darting from one side to another. Whoever had been here wasn't an animal. Someone had come to the cabin during the night. They had walked up to the porch, maybe even stood there listening, watching. I felt exposed. The cabin suddenly seemed too small, too weak. Just thin walls and simple locks. If someone wanted to, they could push right through. I tried to think calmly. Maybe it was a hunter. Maybe someone just curious passing through. But who walks up to a cabin in the middle of the night without knocking, without calling out, without leaving a trace except footprints? That day, I stayed close to the cabin. I kept checking the trees, scanning the edges of the clearing, jumping at every movement of branches. I hardly ate. I felt my nerves stretch thin. When night came, I didn't want to turn off the lamp. I sat on the couch, staring at the door, listening. Hours passed. My eyes grew heavy, but I forced them open. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke with a jolt at a sound. A click. The doorknob. Someone had tried it. Soft, slow, careful. My whole body froze. My breath caught in my throat. The knob rattled again, barely. Testing. Then silence. I sat there, not moving, staring at the door with wide eyes. I didn't know how long I sat like that, but eventually, nothing else happened. No break-in, no more sounds. Whoever it was had left. The next morning, my hands shook as I packed some of my food into a bag. I decided I couldn't stay. Whatever this was, it wasn't safe. I loaded the car quickly, my eyes constantly flicking to the tree line, half expecting to see someone standing there. The forest felt different now. Not peaceful, but watchful. When I finally got into the car and started the engine, relief washed through me. I pulled onto the dirt road, driving faster than before. Every turn of the road, every shadow between the trees, I kept looking for movement. After nearly an hour, I reached the paved road. Only then did I feel like I could breathe again. When I got home, I told my friend I wouldn't be going back. I didn't tell him all the details, just that the place didn't feel right. But I knew what I had heard and what I had seen. Someone had been there. Someone had come in the night, walked right up to the cabin, tested the doorknob while I was inside. And the part that still makes my stomach twist even now, weeks later, is knowing that if I hadn't locked the door, if I hadn't been awake at that moment, I might have opened my eyes to someone standing in the room. That cabin still sits out there in the woods, silent and waiting. I had driven out to the old cabin with the plan of spending a quiet week by myself. The cabin belonged to my uncle, but he hadn't used it in years. It sat deep in the woods, about 6 miles from the nearest paved road, with only a narrow dirt path leading to it. The path was rough and filled with rocks, but my old pickup made it through. I had filled the truck with supplies, enough food, water, and firewood to last me much longer than a week, just in case. I wanted the quiet. I wanted to be alone, away from work, away from noise, and away from people. When I got there, the cabin looked about the same as it did the last time I had seen it years ago. The wood was weathered and faded, but still solid. The roof sagged slightly in one corner, but it kept the rain out. There was a small porch with 2 steps and a single rocking chair that creaked whenever the wind touched it. The place looked forgotten, but it felt good to me. It felt like the kind of place where nobody could bother me. The first day passed quietly. I stacked wood inside, unpacked, checked the locks on the doors and the shutters on the windows, and swept the dust off the floors. I set up my bedding in the main room, made a small fire in the wood stove, and cooked a simple meal. I sat there listening to the crackle of the fire until I fell asleep. The second day I spent walking around the area. The cabin was surrounded by tall pine trees. The forest floor was uneven and thick with fallen needles. I walked to the small creek about a half-mile away, filled my canteen, and washed my face in the cold water. I saw no people, no signs of hunters, hikers, or campers. Just birds, squirrels, and the sound of wind. By the time I got back to the cabin, the sun was lowering, and I was tired from the hike. I cooked again, read a bit from a book I had brought, and went to sleep early. It was the third night when things changed. That night, I woke up to the sound of something outside. It wasn't an animal scurrying across the leaves. It was heavier, slower, and more deliberate. I lay still on the thin mattress with my ears straining. The sound was footsteps, moving on the ground just outside the cabin. They circled slowly, crunching the needles, pausing, then moving again. My chest tightened as I realized it wasn't a deer or a bear. Bears don't walk in circles. I stayed frozen, my heart pounding hard enough that I could feel it in my neck. I thought maybe it was a hunter or a lost hiker, but it was the middle of the night and no one should have been there. I had seen no cars at the trailhead, no tire tracks, no sign of anyone in miles. I pulled the blanket tighter around me, listening. After several minutes, the footsteps stopped near the porch. The wood of the steps creaked faintly. My throat went dry. Whoever it was had stepped onto the porch. Then the boards groaned again as if a weight shifted. The sound of the rocking chair moving slightly in the wind blended with it, but I knew the difference. Someone was standing on the porch of the cabin. I stayed awake for hours, not moving, barely breathing. Eventually the sounds faded and silence returned. But I did not fall back asleep. I stayed there until the faint light of dawn came through the cracks in the shutters. When I stepped outside in the morning, the dirt around the porch was marked with prints. They were from boots, heavy, worn boots. The prints circled the cabin more than once. They were not mine. I walked the perimeter slowly, following the marks. They went off into the trees and disappeared. I felt sick, my stomach tight with unease. I told myself maybe it was just someone passing by, but the cabin was so far from anywhere that it made no sense. That day, I stayed close to the cabin. I split some logs and stacked them, but my eyes kept darting to the trees. The forest felt different now, not peaceful but watchful. I barely ate. When night fell, I barred the door, shut the shutters, and sat by the fire with my ears tuned to every sound. Around midnight, it began again. The crunch of footsteps, slow, steady, circling. My mouth went dry. They were closer this time and slower, as if whoever it was wanted me to hear. I held the hatchet I had been using for firewood. My palms were sweaty against the handle. The steps came right up to the porch again. The boards creaked, then silence. I sat there with my heart racing, staring at the door. The only sound was the fire popping. Then I heard the faintest brush against the window shutters, like fingers sliding along the wood. I didn't sleep that night. When dawn came, I checked again. More boot prints, fresh, deeper than before. Whoever it was had stood there a long time. By the fifth day, my nerves were frayed. I thought about leaving, but the dirt road back was rough, and if someone was watching me, they would see me drive out. I felt trapped. I carried the hatchet with me everywhere inside the cabin. I barely stepped outside. I kept the fire low at night so the glow wouldn't show through the shutters. That night, I heard the sound again, but this time it was different. The steps came faster, heavier. The porch boards groaned under the weight, and then there was a sudden hard rattle on the door. The knob twisted. My chest seized with panic. Someone was trying to open it. The bar across the door held, but the knob rattled again, harder. My whole body shook as I gripped the hatchet and stood frozen. After a few seconds, the rattling stopped. Then silence. The rest of the night was endless. Every creak of the old wood, every gust of wind, made me think the door would burst open. At dawn, when I finally looked outside, the prints on the porch showed where someone had stood directly at the door for a long time. I knew I couldn't last like this. I packed my bag and loaded it into the truck. I planned to leave, but as I turned the key, the engine coughed and died. I tried again. Nothing. The battery was dead. I had checked it when I arrived. It had been fine. Now it was drained. I stepped out and looked at the hood. There were scratches along the side of the truck, long, deliberate scratches in the paint. Someone had tampered with it. I felt my stomach sink. Whoever it was didn't just watch. They wanted me stuck here. The sixth night was the worst. The steps came earlier, just after dark. They circled over and over, closer, slower. I heard the sound of something being dragged across the porch. Then a loud thud against the wall. I stayed in the corner of the cabin, clutching the hatchet, every muscle tight. Hours passed like that, my ears straining, my breath shallow. When morning came, I found a piece of wood propped against the porch. It was from a broken branch, sharpened crudely to a point. It had been left standing upright against the steps, pointing at the door. It was a message. I didn't wait anymore. I packed water, food, and the hatchet. I left the cabin on foot, heading for the dirt path that led 6 miles back to the road. My eyes darted over my shoulder the whole way. The forest felt alive with movement, but I saw nothing. By midday, I reached the main road. I waited there for over an hour until a passing truck came by. The driver stopped, gave me a ride into town. I didn't explain much, just that I had car trouble. I didn't want to tell him the truth. When I returned with a tow truck the next day, the cabin looked the same from the outside. But when I stepped in, my blood ran cold. The hatchet I had carried with me was back inside, lying on the bed where I had been sleeping. Someone had been inside after I left. I never went back again. I decided to spend a week alone in a small cabin deep in the woods. It wasn't anything fancy, just a simple wooden structure tucked away near a lake, about 2 hours from the nearest town. I thought it would be the perfect escape from noise, people, and the constant pull of my phone. The cabin had no Wi-Fi, no service, and no neighbors. It was just me, the trees, and the water. I imagined quiet mornings with coffee, reading books on the porch, maybe some fishing and long hikes. The cabin itself sat on a small clearing surrounded by pine and birch trees. It had 1 bedroom, a little living room with a wood stove, and a tiny kitchen. The bathroom was outside, just an outhouse about 20 yards from the main structure. It was rustic but clean. I'd rented it from an older man who owned several cabins in the area. He'd left the keys in a box by the door, and when I arrived, everything was already set up. The first day was calm. I unpacked my food and gear, checked around the cabin, and set up a small fire pit outside. I liked how quiet it was. The air felt heavy and clean at the same time, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. That night, I cooked pasta on the small propane stove inside, then sat out front with a lantern. The forest was so dark that the light from the lantern only reached a few feet before being swallowed. I noticed how loud the bugs and night birds were, and how every so often the sound of the lake carried across the trees like a low whisper. I slept fine that night, but sometime around 3 in the morning, I woke up to the sound of something moving outside. It wasn't unusual. Animals roamed the area freely. The steps were soft, deliberate, but heavier than a rabbit or squirrel. Maybe a raccoon, maybe a deer. I listened for a while, heart beating harder than I wanted to admit, and eventually drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I checked around outside. Nothing unusual, just some disturbed dirt near the fire pit, maybe from a raccoon nosing around. I shook it off and made coffee. I spent most of the day hiking along the lake and then came back to chop some wood for the stove. By evening, I was sweaty and tired, but satisfied. That night was different. I had gone to bed early, maybe around 10, with a book in my hands. Around midnight, I woke up again, not from a noise this time, but from the absence of noise. The forest had gone completely silent. No crickets, no owls, nothing. That kind of silence doesn't happen often. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, waiting for some normal sound to return. Then I heard it again, the crunch of footsteps on the leaves outside. Slow, steady, circling the cabin. I froze. I wanted to believe it was a deer or some other animal, but it didn't sound like that. These steps had a pattern, a weight to them, almost measured. They stopped by the porch for a while, then moved around toward the side, then the back. I held my breath as the sound of them faded into the distance. For a long time, I didn't move. Eventually, I got out of bed, grabbed the small axe I had used earlier for wood, and stood by the window. I saw nothing but the trees swaying in the dark. The next morning, I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it had been a bear. Bears can walk heavy, and if it was sniffing around the cabin, that might explain the circling. Still, I felt uneasy. I checked the dirt near the cabin. No bear tracks. What I did see, faintly in the soft soil, looked like the outline of a boot print near the porch. It was hard to be sure, but it looked human. I couldn't shake it off after that. The day felt different. Every sound in the woods made me turn my head. Every time the wind moved through the trees, I felt a knot in my stomach. I considered packing up and leaving, but it felt silly. I had rented the place for a week, and I didn't want to overreact to a noise in the night. That evening, I locked the cabin door, something I hadn't bothered with before, and double-checked the windows. I set the axe by the bed and tried to read until I was too tired to keep my eyes open. Sometime past midnight, the sounds came back. Not the steps at first, but the click of something metal outside. It was faint, but sharp like a piece of equipment. I sat up, pulse racing. Then came the steps again, slower this time, right outside the window by the bed. I didn't dare move. Whoever it was or whatever it was, they were inches away, separated only by the thin wooden wall. I stayed still for what felt like an hour. Finally, the steps moved away toward the trees. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was going to leave. I didn't care if it seemed irrational. I started packing up my gear and food, stuffing things into bags as quickly as I could. But when I went to the porch, I froze. The dirt patch where I had seen the faint boot print before now had several clearer ones. Human footprints, size of a man's boot, leading up to the steps and circling around. They hadn't been there yesterday morning. Someone had been there, walking slowly around while I lay awake inside. I felt my mouth go dry. My car was parked about 30 yards away, down a short path. I told myself to just grab my things, throw them in the car, and drive out. But as I carried the first bag outside, I noticed something else. My car's driver's side door was slightly open, not wide, but unlatched. I hadn't left it like that. I walked up to it slowly, axe still in hand. The inside was empty, but I saw it immediately. The glove compartment had been opened and rifled through. My papers were scattered on the floor. Someone had been inside. I dropped the bag in the back seat, shut the door, and went back to the cabin, every sense on fire. My hands were shaking as I finished packing. I kept thinking about how remote the cabin was. If someone wanted to mess with me out here, there was nobody around to stop them. I carried the last of my things outside and loaded the car. I was just about to shut the trunk when I noticed movement in the trees across the clearing. A figure standing still, half hidden in the branches. Tall, broad-shouldered, not moving, just watching. I slammed the trunk shut, ran to the driver's seat, and locked the doors. My hands were trembling so badly I fumbled with the keys, but the engine roared to life. I looked up at the trees again, and the figure was gone. I drove down that dirt road as fast as I dared, the car bouncing over ruts and rocks. I didn't slow down until I hit the main road, and even then, I kept checking the mirror. When I got back to town, I went straight to the police station. I told them everything. They sent an officer to check the cabin, but by the time he got there, the footprints were gone, the car was untouched, and there was no sign of anyone. He said it was probably just trespassers or some local messing around. But I knew what I heard, and I knew what I saw. I never went back to that cabin. Even now, when I think about it, I wonder how long that person had been watching me. Was it just those 2 nights? Or had they been out there from the very first moment I arrived, waiting for me to let my guard down? The thought that stays with me the most is not the footsteps, or the silence, or even the open car door. It's the image of that figure, half hidden in the trees, standing perfectly still, watching me as if they had all the time in the world. I left that place behind, but the fear never really left me. I had been planning the trip for months before I finally drove out to the cabin. I wanted quiet, a break from the noise of the city, a place where I could hear myself think. The cabin I found was listed by someone who owned several acres of forest land far from the nearest town. It was small and old, but it looked solid, and it was cheap to rent for a couple of weeks. I pictured myself sitting on the porch with coffee in the morning, hearing nothing but birds, walking the trails that wound through the woods during the day, maybe even chopping some firewood and cooking meals on the old stove inside. I thought it would be peaceful. I thought it would be exactly what I needed. The drive out there took longer than I thought. The road got narrower as I went, from highway to back road, then to gravel, then finally to a dirt track that twisted between tall trees and felt more like a path than a road. The sun was already low when I reached the clearing. The cabin sat by itself with trees crowding close on 3 sides and a small stretch of uneven grass in front. It was made of dark logs, weathered by years of rain and snow. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, The porch creaked when I stepped on it, but the door was solid, the windows were shut, and inside it was dry and warmer than I expected. The first night passed without anything unusual. I unpacked, set up my things, cooked some canned food on the stove, and read by lantern light until I felt tired. The bed was lumpy, but I was too exhausted from the long drive to care. The forest was so quiet that it almost rang in my ears. I drifted off thinking that I had finally escaped the chaos I left behind. The next day, I walked the woods. I found an old trail that cut deeper into the trees, narrow and half hidden by fallen branches. It wasn't marked, but it was clear enough to follow. The air smelled damp and earthy, and the ground was soft under my boots. I saw animal tracks in the mud, mostly deer, maybe some raccoon. The deeper I went, the darker it became as the trees blocked out the light. After an hour, I decided to turn back. I had no map, and the forest was too thick to risk losing the trail. Back at the cabin, I chopped some wood from a pile of logs stacked behind it. The axe handle was worn smooth, and the blade had a few chips, but it was sharp enough. I worked until my arms ached, then stacked the pieces by the porch. The physical work felt good. I sat on the steps as the sun went down, drinking water and looking out at the tree line. I remember thinking how still it was, how nothing seemed to move once the light faded. It felt like the whole forest was holding its breath. That night, I woke up suddenly. I wasn't sure why at first. The lantern had gone out, and the cabin was black. I could hear the wind moving in the trees outside, faint and steady. Then I realized what woke me. There had been a noise, something sharp against the wall. I lay there listening. After a few seconds, I heard it again. A scrape, slow, like something dragging along the side of the cabin. My body tensed. I held my breath, waiting for it to stop. Came again, closer to the window this time. I sat up slowly, careful not to make the bed creak. My eyes had adjusted enough to make out the faint outline of the window. I thought I saw movement, a shadow passing across it, but it was too quick to be sure. I stayed frozen in place for what felt like an hour, until finally the sound faded and didn't return. I told myself it must have been a branch in the wind, maybe a raccoon looking for food. But when I finally fell back asleep, it was a shallow, restless sleep, and I woke up with a knot in my stomach. In the morning, I walked around the cabin to check. On the wall beneath my window, I saw long streaks in the dirt, as if something had been dragged there. They were too low and too wide to be made by branches. I bent down and touched them. The soil was disturbed, fresh. I looked into the trees, but nothing moved. I tried to laugh it off, but the knot in my stomach grew tighter. The days passed slowly. I kept telling myself I came here to be alone, to get away from noise, but now the silence pressed against me like a weight. Every little sound snapped my head around. A branch breaking in the woods, the wind rattling the shutters, even my own footsteps on the porch made me jump. I still went walking during the day, but I never strayed far from the cabin anymore. I felt watched, though I never saw anyone. On the fourth night, it came back. The same scrape against the wall, slow and deliberate. This time, I didn't sit frozen. I grabbed the axe I kept near the door and stood by the window, my heart pounding. I wanted to look out, but I couldn't bring myself to pull the curtain. The noise dragged along one wall, then around to the porch. The boards creaked as something stepped on them. I could hear it clearly now. Footsteps, slow, heavy, measured. I stood there with the axe raised, sweating, every muscle shaking. The footsteps moved across the porch, then stopped right outside the door. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. I could hear my own breathing, sharp and shallow. Minutes passed. I stayed there, staring at the door, certain the latch would lift any second. But nothing happened. Eventually, the footsteps moved again, slower this time, until they faded away. When the sun came up, I checked the porch. The dirt showed prints. Not boots, not bare feet. Just deep impressions, shapeless, as if something heavy had pressed into the ground without leaving detail. I stared at them for a long time, trying to make sense of it. They weren't animal, and they weren't human in any way I recognized. The next day, I packed my things. I told myself I'd leave, drive back to town, forget the whole thing. But when I tried the truck, it wouldn't start. The battery was dead. I hadn't left the lights on, and it was working fine before. I lifted the hood, but I didn't know enough about engines to fix anything. I was stuck there. Nights blurred into each other after that. The noises returned, always after midnight, always circling the cabin. Sometimes it scraped the walls, sometimes it tapped the glass of the windows so lightly it almost seemed playful. I hardly slept. I stayed awake with the axe in my hands, jumping at every sound. My food supply went down faster than I planned, because I ate just to stay awake. On the 8th night, it tried the door. The latch rattled as something pulled on it. The hinges groaned. I braced my weight against the wood, gripping the axe so tight my hands went numb. The door held, but I knew it wouldn't forever. When it stopped, I heard the slow drag of something heavy across the porch, like it was carrying weight. I couldn't take it anymore. The next morning, I filled my backpack with what food I had left, strapped the axe to it, and set out on the trail I had found earlier. I didn't know exactly where it led, but I figured if I kept walking long enough, I'd hit a road or another cabin. Anything was better than waiting inside those walls another night. The woods were silent as I walked. Every step felt too loud. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something following, but the path behind me was always empty. The trail twisted endlessly through the trees. My legs ached. My throat burned from lack of water. Hours passed, and still no sign of a road. By evening, I realized I was lost. The trail had split at some point, and I must have taken the wrong turn. My map was useless because I didn't have one. The forest looked the same in every direction. I had no choice but to keep moving. When night came, I stopped and built a small fire with the matches I brought. I had been looking forward to a quiet break for weeks. Work had been weighing on me, and I wanted to get away from the noise of the city. A friend of mine had mentioned a small old cabin that could be rented out deep in the woods. It was remote, quiet, and had no distractions. That was exactly what I needed. The drive out there was long, nearly 5 hours, most of it on back roads that grew narrower and rougher as I got closer. Trees crowded both sides, and the deeper I went, the more I realized how cut off it was from everything. I didn't see a single house for miles once I got off the main road. Eventually, I found the dirt path that led to the cabin. It was bumpy and overgrown, my car barely making it through, but when I finally reached the clearing, I felt a kind of relief. The cabin stood there, small and weathered, surrounded by trees that stretched high into the sky. It had one porch with a couple of steps leading up. The wood was old, and the roof looked like it had seen better days. But I liked it. It had that quiet, secluded feeling I wanted. I carried my things inside. The cabin wasn't much. Just one main room with a bed in the corner, a table, a couple of chairs, and a small wood stove. There was a door at the back that led to what looked like a storage area. The windows were small, but they let in enough light. There was no electricity. I had brought lanterns, candles, and plenty of supplies. My plan was to stay 3 nights, maybe 4, and just rest, read, and clear my head. The first evening was calm. I made myself a simple dinner from what I had packed, lit a lantern, and sat by the table with a book. The silence was heavy but not unpleasant. All I could hear was the occasional creak of the cabin settling and the distant sound of wind moving through the trees. I went to bed early and slept surprisingly well. The next day, I explored the area a little. The forest was thick, and the ground was uneven. There were no real trails, but I wandered just far enough to get a sense of the place. The stillness was almost total. I didn't see another person, not even an animal larger than a squirrel. When I returned to the cabin, I chopped some wood, gathered water from a nearby stream, and prepared for the evening. It was during the second night that I began to feel uneasy. I was lying in bed, reading by lantern light, when I thought I heard something outside. It was faint, like a footstep or a branch breaking. I held still, listening, but the sound didn't come again. After a while, I blew out the lantern and closed my eyes. The silence pressed in. Every small creak of the cabin sounded sharper. I told myself it was just the woods settling, maybe an animal moving through. Eventually, I drifted off, but around midnight I woke suddenly. I wasn't sure what had pulled me out of sleep. The cabin was pitch black. I strained my ears. For a moment, there was nothing. Then I heard it again. A slow, deliberate sound outside, like footsteps moving across the ground. They weren't constant. They would come, then stop. Then after a pause, another. My heart began to race. I sat up in bed, staring into the dark. The window was too black to see through. I didn't move for what felt like forever. Then the sound stopped completely. I waited, barely breathing. Minutes passed. Finally, I convinced myself it was probably a deer or some other animal. The woods were full of them. I lay back down, but sleep didn't come easy. Every sound seemed sharper, every creak louder. When morning came, I stepped outside to look around. The ground was damp from a light rain during the night. That's when I noticed something. On the patch of mud near the porch steps, there were clear footprints. Not boots like mine, but bare feet. They were faint, partly smudged by the rain, but they were there. Human. My stomach dropped. I looked around the clearing. Nothing. Just trees and silence. I tried to calm myself, telling myself maybe they had been there for days, maybe even weeks, but something about them looked fresh. I went through the day unsettled. I tried reading, tried chopping more wood, tried to distract myself, but I kept glancing toward the trees. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been close, maybe even watching. That night, I couldn't relax. I kept the lantern burning longer, listening for any sound outside. For hours, it was quiet. Then, sometime past midnight, I heard it again. Soft steps circling the cabin. My skin went cold. I sat frozen, heart pounding. The steps would move closer, then fade, then return. I couldn't see anything through the window, only darkness. I thought about shouting, but the silence was too heavy, and I felt like if I made a sound, whoever was out there would know exactly where I was. Instead, I sat in the dark, clutching the small hatchet I had brought for chopping wood. My mouth was dry, and every muscle in my body was tense. The steps went on for what felt like an hour. Then they stopped. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in bed, wide awake, waiting for morning. When the light finally came, I went outside again. The ground was damp with dew, and sure enough, more footprints were there. Clearer this time, bare feet again, circling the cabin. My stomach turned. I knew then it wasn't my imagination. Someone had been out there, walking barefoot around the cabin in the middle of the night. I thought about leaving right then, but the drive out was long, and part of me felt stubborn, like I didn't want to be scared off. I told myself maybe it was just some strange drifter, maybe they had passed through and were gone. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. That day, I kept busy. I stayed close to the cabin, always keeping my hatchet near. I tried to eat, but I wasn't hungry. The forest that had felt peaceful now felt suffocating, like it was hiding someone just out of sight. When night came again, I was on edge. I bolted the door, pulled the curtains tight, and kept the lantern low. I sat at the table, hatchet in hand, listening. Hours passed. Nothing. I almost began to relax. But then, sometime deep into the night, I heard something different. Not footsteps this time. A slow, dragging sound along the side of the cabin wall. Wood creaked as if someone brushed against it. My chest tightened. The sound moved, circling. Then a faint scrape at the window. I froze. My skin prickled all over. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The scrape came again, slow, deliberate, like a fingertip running along the glass. I gripped the hatchet tighter, every muscle screaming to move, but I stayed still. The sound stopped after a while. The silence that followed was worse. I sat there until the first light of dawn broke. When I stepped outside, I saw smears on the window, muddy streaks like someone had pressed their hand against the glass. My chest felt hollow. Whoever it was had been right there, inches from me. I knew I couldn't stay another night. I packed my things quickly, barely eating, stuffing everything into the car. My eyes kept darting to the tree line. The silence felt heavier than ever. I had the sense that if I lingered too long, something bad would happen. I started the car and drove out along the rough dirt path, heart hammering until I finally reached the main road. I didn't slow down. Even now, back in the city, safe in my apartment, I can't shake the memory. The footprints, the handprint on the glass, the sound of someone circling in the dark. I never saw them, not once, but I know they were there. And what unsettles me most is not knowing why. I had been waiting for months to get some time off work and spend a few quiet days alone in the woods. The idea of shutting out the noise of the city, the constant movement of cars, the ringing of phones, and the endless tasks that never seemed to slow down had been on my mind for too long. I wanted to disconnect, breathe fresh air, and hear nothing but the sound of wind in the trees. A friend of mine had told me about a small cabin tucked away deep in the forest, an old place people barely used anymore. He had given me directions written on paper, rough and simple, like he wasn't even sure himself. I trusted him, though, and I decided that this cabin would be the perfect place for me to recharge. The drive out took hours. The road turned narrower the farther I went, cracked asphalt giving way to gravel, and then gravel becoming dirt. My car rattled against the rocks, the suspension creaking every time I rolled over a rut. The trees grew taller, thicker, and denser as I pushed deeper into the woods. It was afternoon when I finally reached a clearing where the cabin stood. The place looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The wood was dark from weather, the roof sagged slightly on one side, and the windows were cloudy with dust and grime. There was a small porch with steps that looked like they could snap if I wasn't careful. Still, the cabin held a strange comfort. It was simple, out of the way, and exactly what I had wanted: solitude. When I stepped inside, the air was stale. The floor creaked under my boots, and the smell of old wood and dust filled my nose. A table sat in the corner with two chairs, one leg of the table propped up by a piece of wood. Against the far wall was a small bed, its mattress thin and sagging in the middle. There was a wood stove by the window, its iron surface marked by rust. It wasn't much, but I hadn't come for luxury. I dropped my bag on the bed and decided to open a few windows to let in some air. The silence hit me once I settled in. It was heavy, unlike the city where there was always something in the background. Out here, even the trees seemed to hush themselves. I spent the first hour walking the clearing, checking the area. The grass was long and uneven, patches of dirt showing through. Beyond the clearing was the forest, thick with pine and oak, their trunks rising close together. I cooked a simple meal on a small camping stove I had brought with me. As the sun went down, I lit a lantern and placed it on the table. The light cast long shadows across the cabin, stretching into corners I hadn't really looked at before. I tried to read, but my mind kept wandering to the silence outside. Every crack of the wood settling, every brush of wind against the window felt louder than it should have. The first night passed quietly enough, though I didn't sleep much. The mattress was uncomfortable, and I found myself staring at the ceiling, listening. The forest made noises I wasn't used to. Branches snapped, leaves rustled, and sometimes it sounded like something moved through the undergrowth. I told myself it was animals. Out here, it had to be. The next morning, I stepped outside with a mug of coffee and looked around the clearing. Something caught my eye by the tree line. The grass there was flattened, like something had walked through during the night. A trail of pressed-down blades led into the trees. I crouched and looked closer. The shape wasn't clear, but it was wider than a deer track. I told myself it could have been a bear or maybe even just the wind pushing branches down. I didn't like how uneasy it made me feel, though. I tried to brush it off. The day was long, and I spent it hiking around the area, marking small paths so I wouldn't get lost. The woods felt endless, the trees pressing in on all sides. At one point, I realized I couldn't hear a single bird. The stillness was unnerving, but I shook it off. By the time I got back, the sun was low, and I was tired. I cooked, ate, and sat on the porch until dark. That night was harder. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to a sound outside. It wasn't an animal scurrying, not the cracking of branches. It was slower, heavier, like steps. My chest tightened as I lay there, holding my breath. The sound moved across the clearing, closer to the cabin. I didn't move. The steps stopped, and the silence was worse than the noise. I stared at the ceiling, afraid to look out the window. After what felt like forever, the sound faded, like it was moving back into the trees. In the morning, I went outside to look. The grass in front of the porch was pressed down, leading toward the tree line. It wasn't shaped like a boot, not exactly, but it was too big for any animal I could think of. The tracks didn't look fresh, either. They blended into the grass like something had been there often. I felt my stomach tighten, but I tried not to overthink. Could have been hunters, maybe even kids exploring the woods. The cabin wasn't mine after all. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever or whatever had been there was interested in the cabin. Interested in me. I decided to stay inside more that day. I cleaned, organized my bag, and stacked some wood by the stove. By evening, I was restless, checking the windows every few minutes. When night fell, I left the lantern off and sat in the dark, listening. Hours passed in silence, until I heard it again. Slow, heavy steps outside. This time they circled the cabin. The floor creaked beneath me as I shifted, and the steps stopped. My heart pounded so loud I thought it would give me away. I sat frozen, staring into the dark. After several minutes, the sound started again, moving toward the back of the cabin. I heard a scrape, like something brushing against the wall. Then silence. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I forced myself to look around the cabin. At the back wall, I found scratches low near the wood, fresh enough to stand out. They weren't claw marks. They looked more like something sharp had been dragged there. By then, I couldn't pretend it was just animals. Someone was out there. Someone was watching the cabin at night, coming close enough to circle it, close enough to touch the walls. I thought about leaving, but the road back was long, and I didn't feel safe driving it in the dark. I told myself I would pack up and leave the next morning. That day dragged on endlessly. I kept glancing at the tree line, expecting to see someone step out. The forest felt wrong, too still, as if holding its breath. I stacked furniture against the door before night fell. When darkness came, I turned off the lantern again and sat in the corner, clutching a flashlight like it was a weapon. The footsteps came later this time, almost as if whoever was out there knew I was waiting. They moved slower, pausing often, circling again. At one point, the steps stopped right outside the window. I held my breath, not daring to move. Then, softly, the sound of something brushing the glass. Not knocking, just a faint scrape. I stayed frozen until dawn. When the light finally came, I didn't hesitate. I packed everything, grabbed my bag, and got into the car. My hands shook as I started the engine. As I drove out of the clearing, I looked back once. For just a moment, I thought I saw movement near the trees. Something tall, standing still, watching. I didn't slow down. The drive back felt longer than the drive in. Every turn, every stretch of road, I kept checking the mirrors. My chest stayed tight until the forest finally thinned and I reached pavement again. I never went back to that cabin. Later, I told myself it must have been hunters or someone living off the grid, curious about why I was there. Maybe they had been keeping an eye on the place for a long time, and I had just wandered into their territory. I don't know for sure, and I don't want to. What I do know is that I wasn't alone out there. Someone was watching me every night, circling that cabin, waiting. And the worst part wasn't what they did. It was knowing that if they had wanted to, I would never have made it out. I went to the cabin at the edge of the forest because I needed a break from everything. My head was heavy from weeks of work, the constant sound of the city, and the way the days all felt the same. I wanted quiet and I wanted to be alone for a while. The cabin belonged to a friend of my uncle, and I had only been there once before for a short visit. I remembered it being simple, with bare wood walls, a small fireplace, and just enough furniture to make it livable. It sat back from the dirt road by a good stretch of trees, so you couldn't see it from the road unless you knew where to look. I brought only what I thought I needed: some clothes, a small cooler with food, a couple bottles of water, and my sleeping bag. There was no electricity there, just a couple of old oil lamps and candles, and I liked the idea of that. No phone service either, which at first sounded like freedom. I parked my car just off the road, carried my things up the uneven path, and unlocked the door with the key I had been given. The cabin smelled like dry wood, dust, and old smoke from the fireplace. It was quiet inside, the kind of silence that feels thicker than air, where you notice every small creak in the floor. The first night I settled in, lit one of the lamps, and unpacked. I could hear wind outside moving slowly through the trees, and the occasional knock of a branch against the roof. I told myself I was ready for quiet, but as night came down, the silence began to feel different. Every sound outside stood out too much. A crack of a branch sounded sharp, like it was just outside the wall. The scratching of something small, maybe a mouse or squirrel, echoed in the corner. I tried to sleep on the old couch in the main room, but every time I shut my eyes, I thought I heard movement outside. I woke up several times that night. Once I thought I heard heavy steps on the porch, but when I sat up and listened hard, I only heard the wind again. I told myself it was just branches falling or an animal moving close. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. My heart was beating fast for no reason, and the quiet didn't calm me like I thought it would. The next day, I tried to shake it off. I went for a walk down the dirt road, stretched my legs, and took in the forest. It was early fall, so the leaves had started to turn. Reds and yellows stood out against the green. The air was cool, and the sun moved in and out between the tall trees. I told myself I was fine, that the night just made me nervous because I wasn't used to this kind of stillness anymore. When I came back, I noticed something strange. The door to the cabin was open a crack. I was sure I had shut it when I left. The lock wasn't broken, but the door just hung slightly open like it hadn't caught when I closed it. I tried to convince myself I just didn't pull it shut all the way. Still, the air inside felt colder than outside, and I found myself looking around the small rooms, checking corners, checking the tiny kitchen. Everything looked untouched. Nothing was missing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there. That night was worse. The sounds were louder. I kept hearing what I swore was movement in the woods. Not just animals, slow, heavy steps, the kind of rhythm that sounded too steady to be random. My chest grew tight, and I tried to calm myself by focusing on the sound of the wind again. But there were times when the wind went still, and I still heard crunching leaves. I didn't sleep much. The third day I felt drained, but I tried to stay busy. I cut some wood with the old axe behind the cabin, stacked it neatly by the wall, and kept telling myself that I was being paranoid. I wanted to believe it was just the new setting, my city nerves not used to real silence. But while I worked, I kept glancing over my shoulder, scanning the tree line. At times, I swore I saw movement between the trunks, something quick, like a person ducking out of sight. When I tried to stare hard in that direction, there was nothing. Later, when I went to bring water from the stream down the hill, I found something that made me feel sick. Near the bank, I saw footprints in the mud. They weren't mine. They were larger, deeper, and fresh. Someone had been walking there, and the prints led up the slope toward the trees near the cabin. I froze, holding my jug in my hand, staring at the shapes. I couldn't tell if they belonged to a man or something else, but they were human-shaped. I felt my stomach twist and a shiver run down my back. That night, I didn't light the lamp. I sat in the dark, hoping if someone was outside, they wouldn't see me. I sat completely still, listening. The steps came again, closer this time, circling around the cabin. My throat felt dry, and I could hear my pulse in my ears. Something brushed against the outside wall, a dragging sound, like fingers or a stick. I wanted to scream or run, but my body stayed frozen. I didn't sleep at all. The fourth morning, I found the woodpile I had stacked scattered across the ground. It wasn't like the wind had blown it over. It looked as if someone had kicked through it on purpose. The axe I had left leaning against the wall was gone. My chest felt hollow when I saw that. I stood there staring at the empty spot, my hands shaking, realizing someone had taken it. I thought about leaving that morning, packing up and driving out, but part of me wanted to believe I could handle it, that I was just scaring myself. Still, I checked the car. Nothing seemed touched, but I couldn't stop the feeling that someone was close, watching. That night, I decided to stay awake and listen. I sat on the couch in the dark, gripping the handle of a kitchen knife I had found in the drawer. Hours passed, my eyelids heavy, but then I heard it again. The steps on the porch, slow, deliberate. The boards creaked under weight. I held my breath. The doorknob rattled gently, as if someone was testing it. Then silence. I sat there frozen, gripping the knife so hard my hand ached, waiting for more sound. After what felt like forever, I heard the steps move away into the woods. The next day, I was certain I had to leave. But when I went out to the car, I found the tires slashed. Both front tires cut deep. The knife marks were obvious. My legs went weak, and I stood there shaking, realizing I was stuck. Whoever was out there didn't want me leaving. The following night was the worst. I pushed a chair under the door handle and sat with my back against the wall, knife in hand. I didn't light the lamp. I didn't move. Around midnight, I heard the soft scrape of metal against the wood outside, like the sound of a blade. The walls seemed to close in. My heart felt like it would break out of my chest. The dragging sound circled the cabin slowly. At one point, I heard a thud against the back wall, sharp and heavy, as if something had been thrown. By morning, I was barely holding myself together. My eyes burned from no sleep, and every nerve in me felt raw. I packed what I could into my bag, grabbed my water, and decided to walk out. The road stretched for miles, but I couldn't stay. I kept my knife in my hand the whole time as I moved quickly down the dirt road, glancing back every few steps, terrified I would see someone following. I made it several miles before a truck came down the road. I stepped into the middle and waved it down with both arms, shaking. The driver, a man in his 50s, stopped and let me in. I didn't explain much, just asked to be taken to the nearest town. When I got there, I called someone to pick me up and never went back. Later, when I told the owner of the cabin about it, he looked uneasy and said nothing. I knew he had heard me, but he didn't want to talk about it. He didn't ask for the key back either. I knew then that what I felt was real. Someone had been there, circling, waiting, pushing me toward breaking. I was lucky I left when I did. I think about it often. The sound of steps outside the walls, the missing axe, the cut tires, the doorknob rattling in the dark. Whoever it was, they never forced their way in. They wanted me to know they were out there, wanted to wear me down. If I had stayed longer, I don't know what would have happened. The cabin still stands out there in the woods, quiet and alone, but I will never set foot near it again. I had been looking forward to a quiet week away from everything. I had been working long hours for months, barely sleeping, and my head felt like it was always buzzing. I needed a break, something that would take me away from people, noise, and the city. A coworker told me about a small cabin they once rented up in the hills, not far from a lake. It was simple, no fancy amenities, just a roof, walls, a wood stove, and the kind of silence that felt impossible in the city. That was exactly what I wanted. I booked it without much thought. The drive up was longer than I expected. The road turned from smooth pavement to cracked asphalt, then to gravel, then finally to dirt. By the time I reached the cabin, my small car was covered in dust, and I could feel every muscle in my arms from gripping the steering wheel along the rough trail. But when I stepped out, the air hit me, fresh, sharp, cool, with a hint of pine and damp soil. The place was quiet in a way that almost made my ears ring. No hum of traffic, no voices, nothing. Just trees pressing close on every side, and the small log cabin standing in the clearing like it had been dropped there decades ago and never moved again. The cabin itself was smaller than I imagined. A single room, wooden walls stained dark from years of weather, a roof that sagged a little in the middle, and a porch with 2 steps leading up to it. The lock was just a latch, simple but functional. Inside, there was a single bed pushed against the far wall, a wood-burning stove with a short chimney, a counter with a few cupboards, and an old table with 1 chair. No electricity, No running water, no bathroom, just an outhouse a short walk behind the cabin. It was the kind of place that demanded you adjust, not the other way around. I liked that. The first day was peaceful. I unpacked a few supplies I brought, mostly canned food, bottled water, a couple of cooking pans, and a lantern. I set everything neatly on the table and shelves. I checked the outhouse, a rough wooden box with a hole cut in a bench, and it smelled the way all outhouses smell, but it was usable. I spent the afternoon walking around the area. A faint trail wound down toward the lake, about a 15-minute walk through thick trees. The water was dark, still, and surrounded by reeds. There was no dock, no signs of boats, no other cabins in sight. I stood at the edge, looking out at the reflection of the trees, and felt a sense of relief, like I had stepped into a place where the rest of the world couldn't reach me. That night, I sat inside with the lantern, ate a can of beans warmed on the stove, and listened to the woods outside. The sound was constant but soft, wind through branches, the occasional snap of something in the underbrush, and the call of a night bird far away. I wasn't scared, not yet. I felt calm. I even slept early, tucked into the bed with my jacket still on because the cabin got cold fast once the stove died down. The second day started the same way. I boiled water on the stove for instant coffee, ate a granola bar, and walked again. I hiked farther this time, circling through the trees and trying to get a sense of the area. The forest felt endless, every direction looking the same. Tall trees, fallen branches, patches of moss. Sometimes I saw animal tracks, mostly deer, maybe a raccoon. Once I saw something bigger, probably a bear, though the tracks looked old. I kept note of where I walked, marking trees lightly with a small knife, because I didn't want to get lost. I spent most of the afternoon just wandering, then came back when the light began to fade. It was that evening that the feeling shifted. I was sitting on the porch as the sky darkened, the air turning colder, when I heard something. At first, it was just a rustle in the trees. Normal enough, I thought, but it didn't fade away like a deer moving past. Kept moving, slow, steady, closer. I squinted into the tree line, but the shadows were thick, and I couldn't make anything out. Then it stopped. Dead silence, heavier than before. The hair on my neck prickled. I waited, holding my breath. After maybe a full minute, the sound picked up again, this time moving away, deeper into the forest. I told myself it was just an animal. Probably was. Still, I shut the cabin door and slid the latch before bed. That night, I woke up suddenly. No sound woke me, not that I could tell. It was the kind of sudden, sharp waking that made me sit up in bed instantly. The lantern was out, and the cabin was dark except for faint moonlight through the window. My ears strained, and after a few seconds I heard it. The crunch of leaves. Slow steps, close, circling the cabin. My body went rigid. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The steps were careful, deliberate, dragging slightly, then stopping. I counted in my head, every second stretching long. Then the sound moved again, around toward the back of the cabin. I wanted to look out the window, but I couldn't make myself move. Finally, after what felt like forever, the sound faded into the woods. I lay back down, but I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. In the morning, I walked around the cabin. The ground was littered with leaves and pine needles, so footprints weren't clear, but I thought I saw a few spots where leaves had been shifted unnaturally, pressed down. It wasn't enough to be sure. My chest felt tight as I stood there, scanning the trees. I told myself again it was an animal. A bear, maybe a coyote, but something about the way it moved didn't sit right. Animals don't usually circle slowly like that. Still, I pushed it down and went about my day. The third night was worse. I tried to sleep early again, but I woke to the same sound. Footsteps outside, slow, circling. This time they stopped directly at the window. I could hear breathing, faint but real. I froze, my heart hammering so hard I thought it would give me away. I didn't look. I just stayed still under the blanket, staring at the dark ceiling. After several minutes, the sound moved again around the cabin, fading like before. When dawn came, I forced myself outside. Again, nothing clear, just faint disturbances on the ground. I thought about leaving that day, packing my things and driving back down the dirt road, forgetting the whole trip. But I told myself I was overreacting. I had paid for the cabin and it was just a week. Maybe it was just paranoia from being alone. I convinced myself to stay. That night, I made sure to bolt the door tight, stacked a chair under the handle, and kept the lantern lit low. But sometime past midnight, I woke again. This time the sound wasn't outside. It was inside. The door was still shut, still latched, the chair unmoved. But I heard the soft creak of the floorboards at the far end of the cabin. Slow, deliberate weight shifting. My throat closed. I gripped the blanket in both hands, staring into the darkness, trying to convince myself it was just the cabin settling. But the sound came again. A step, then silence. I stayed like that until the faint light of dawn began to creep in. When I finally sat up, the cabin was empty. No sign of anyone, no footprints on the floor. Nothing. But I knew what I heard. By the fifth night, I was at the end of my nerves. I barely ate, barely moved from the porch during the day. I watched the tree line constantly, jumping at every sound. When night came, I didn't even bother lying down. I sat at the table with the lantern burning, gripping the knife I used for marking trees. My ears strained for any noise. Hours passed. Then, close to 2 in the morning, there it was again, footsteps outside. Slow, steady. I stood, knife in hand, heart pounding. The steps circled, closer and closer, then stopped at the door. The latch rattled. I froze, staring at it. The chair under the handle shuddered as something tested the door, slow but forceful. Then silence. I waited, every muscle locked. After a long moment, the sound moved again, around the cabin, fading into the woods. I didn't sleep at all. The next morning, I packed. I couldn't stay. My hands shook as I shoved cans into my bag, grabbed the lantern, stuffed my clothes away. I loaded the car as fast as I could, scanning the woods with every step. When I finally slid into the driver's seat, I felt a rush of relief. I started the car, turned it down the dirt road, and didn't look back. The road wound through the trees for miles before hitting gravel. I drove faster than I should have, tires slipping on loose stone, hands gripping the wheel so tight they hurt. When I finally saw pavement, I almost cried. I don't know who or what was out there. Maybe it was a hunter messing with me. Maybe someone living off the grid. Maybe worse. All I know is I heard them night after night, circling that cabin, testing the door, standing at the window. I left and I will never go back. The silence I wanted turned into something else. Something that still keeps me awake even now, long after I'm back home, safe in the city. Because sometimes, late at night, when the streets outside are quiet, I swear I hear it again. The slow crunch of footsteps, circling. I had been looking forward to spending some time alone in the small cabin for months. The place was tucked deep in the woods, far from the nearest town, and far enough off the main road that hardly anyone passed through unless they knew it was there. The cabin was old, built long before I had even been born, but it still stood strong. It had one bedroom, a small kitchen, a bathroom, and a living area that faced out toward the forest. There was a porch too, with 2 chairs, where I imagined I would sit in the evenings with nothing but the sound of the trees around me. I had taken time off work just to come here. I needed space away from everything. No phone calls, no city noise, no work stress. Just me, the woods, and the quiet. The first 2 days went exactly as I hoped. I spent most of the time sitting outside, listening to the wind move through the trees. Sometimes I walked the small trails around the cabin. The air smelled sharp with pine, and the nights were cold enough that I had to wrap myself in 2 blankets. It was peaceful, the kind of peace that made me feel like I was the only person left in the world. But by the 3rd night, something changed. That evening, I had cooked myself a simple meal. I washed the dishes, turned out the lights, and sat down in the living room with a lantern burning low. I remember listening closely to the woods as I usually did, but that night the woods seemed quieter than normal. Normally, I could hear owls or the faint sounds of small animals moving in the brush, but that night, there was nothing. No chirping, no rustling, not even the wind. The stillness made me uneasy, though I tried to push it out of my mind. Later, when I finally went to bed, I locked the door and set the lantern on the table beside me. I lay there in the dark, listening to the silence. My body felt tense, like it was waiting for something. I must have dozed off, but a sound woke me. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to pull me out of sleep. It sounded like gravel crunching under weight, like footsteps on the dirt path outside the cabin. I froze. The cabin was too far from the road for anyone to be out there casually walking. I hadn't told anyone I was here except for one close friend back home, and even they wouldn't have shown up unannounced. The sound came again, this time closer, like someone stepping near the porch. I held my breath and listened. Then it stopped. For a long time, I didn't hear anything else. I lay there staring into the dark, my ears straining, my heart racing so hard I could feel it thudding against my chest. Minutes went by. Nothing. I told myself it could have been a deer, maybe a raccoon. I tried to relax. Finally, after what felt like an hour, I drifted back into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside and looked around. The dirt path that led up to the porch had marks on it. At first, I thought they were just scuffs from my own boots, but then I noticed they were fresher and slightly larger than mine. They were shaped like footprints, human footprints. They led up close to the porch steps and then turned back toward the trees. I felt sick when I saw them. Someone had walked right up to the cabin in the night, stopped there, and then walked back into the woods. No knock on the door, no call out, just silent footsteps, then gone. For the rest of the day, I couldn't relax. Every little sound made me jump. The woods that had felt peaceful before now felt heavy, like they were holding something inside them. I tried to shake it off, telling myself again it could have been a hiker who got lost, but deep down I knew it wasn't that. Nobody hikes that deep into private woods in the middle of the night, and if they did, they wouldn't just walk up to a cabin and then disappear. That night, I made sure the windows were locked. I even pushed a chair under the doorknob in the living room. I kept the lantern on longer than usual, the glow making me feel a little safer, though not much. I lay down again, listening hard. Around midnight, I heard it again. The crunch of footsteps, this time slower, more deliberate. My chest tightened instantly. I lay still, gripping the blanket in my fists, straining my ears. The steps stopped right outside the window of the bedroom. I could almost feel the presence of someone standing there in the dark, just beyond the thin wall separating us. My throat went dry. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then, softly, I heard the sound of fingers brushing against the wooden siding of the cabin. A slow drag, like someone running their hand across the wall as they moved along it. The sound slid from one side of the window toward the corner of the cabin. Then it stopped again. I don't know how long I lay there, but eventually, exhaustion pulled me back into sleep, though it was broken and restless. In the morning, when I worked up the courage to look, I found smudges along the wall where dirt-stained hands had pressed against the wood. They were low enough to be human. I felt my stomach twist when I saw them. That day, I didn't leave the cabin. I stayed inside, the curtains drawn, listening for anything outside. My food supplies were fine, but I couldn't eat much. My stomach stayed tight, my body tense. Every time I thought about packing up and leaving, I reminded myself the nearest town was far, and the road was rough. If someone was really out there, it wasn't safe to be on foot or alone in a car. So I stayed. That night was the worst yet. I had just begun to doze when I heard the sound again, but this time it wasn't footsteps on gravel. It was the faint creak of the porch boards under weight. Whoever it was had come back, and now they were standing on the porch itself. My entire body went cold. The boards groaned slowly, as if whoever it was shifted their weight carefully. Then I heard it, a light tap on the window. Not hard, not fast, just a single tap, like the faint knock of a fingernail on the glass. I couldn't move. Another tap, then silence. I gripped the flashlight I had beside the bed but didn't dare turn it on. Part of me thought if I stayed quiet enough, they would leave. Minutes dragged by. The silence was unbearable, stretching out until I felt like I would go mad from waiting. Then, all at once, the sound of footsteps moved away, down the porch, back across the gravel path and into the woods. I lay awake until dawn. When daylight came, I checked the porch. There were marks again. Muddy smears on the boards near the window, as if someone had crouched there. My legs felt weak when I saw them. I knew now it wasn't an accident. Whoever was coming out here was doing it on purpose. I lasted one more day. I stayed locked inside, jumping at every sound, heart pounding at every creak of the wood. When the sun began to set, I knew I couldn't go through another night. I packed what I could into my bag and decided I would leave before it got fully dark. I walked to my car quickly, glancing over my shoulder at the woods. The silence was unbearable again, heavy and suffocating. I threw my bag inside, started the engine, and turned onto the dirt road that led away from the cabin. The tires crunched on gravel as I drove as fast as the rough path allowed. Halfway down the road, I saw something that made my blood run cold. On the side of the road, half hidden by the trees, was a figure standing still, watching me. I couldn't make out their face, but I saw the shape of their body, the stillness of their posture. They didn't move, didn't step forward, just stood there as I drove past. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I kept my eyes forward and pressed harder on the gas until I finally reached the main road. I never went back to the cabin again. For weeks afterward, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured the dark woods, the smudges on the wall, the muddy prints on the porch, and the figure by the road watching me as I fled. Whoever they were, they hadn't wanted to break in or speak or make themselves known. They had just wanted to watch, to remind me that I wasn't alone. And that was worse than anything else. That cabin still stands out there, deep in the woods, but I will never see it again. I arrived at the cabin later in the day than I had planned. The road leading up to it was rough, full of potholes and loose gravel, and my small truck bounced heavily with every dip. The area was far from any town, with only miles of forest stretching in every direction. The cabin had been recommended by a coworker who told me it was the perfect place to shut myself away for a while and just enjoy peace and quiet. I had been under a lot of stress, and the idea of a weekend alone in the woods had seemed like exactly what I needed. The cabin looked old when I first pulled up. The roof was dark with age, the wood siding weathered and cracked in a few places. It was clear that no one had done much maintenance on it in years, but it still stood solid. There was a small porch at the front with 2 wooden steps leading up to the door. To the left of the porch, the forest grew so close that tree branches nearly brushed the windows. To the right, the trees opened up slightly, revealing a slope that led down to a wide stretch of brush. The silence out here was stronger than I expected. It wasn't the kind of silence you find in a house at night with faint hums of appliances in the background. This was the kind of silence where even the smallest sound, like a pine needle snapping under my boot, felt too loud. I shut off the engine and just sat there for a while, staring at the trees, feeling that stillness pressing around me. When I finally got out, the air smelled sharp and clean, mixed with the heavy scent of pine. I hauled my bag out of the truck bed and walked up to the porch. The wood creaked loudly under my weight. When I unlocked the door, it stuck halfway before giving way with a shove. Inside, the air smelled of dust and old wood. The cabin wasn't large. There was a small kitchen on one side, a single table with 2 chairs, and a living space with an old sofa and a wood stove. At the back, a short hallway led to 1 bedroom and a bathroom. The windows were narrow, and all of them looked out directly into the trees. The forest pressed so close that even from inside I couldn't see more than a few yards into it. I set my bag down on the sofa and walked through the place, checking each room. The bedroom was small, with just a bed and a dresser. The bathroom had a sink, toilet, and a shower that looked like it hadn't been used in years. Everything was quiet, so quiet that I kept catching myself holding my breath. I unpacked my things slowly, then went outside to take a walk before it got dark. The trail behind the cabin was faint, just a narrow break in the undergrowth that led deeper into the woods. I didn't follow it far, just enough to get a sense of the area. Every step made me aware of how far I was from anyone else. There were no distant car sounds, no far-off barking dogs, no airplane engines above. Only the rustle of leaves, the occasional call of a bird, and the snapping of twigs under my boots. By the time I returned to the cabin, the light was starting to fade. The shadows between the trees grew darker, and the air grew colder. I locked the front door, dropped the latch on the back door, and drew the thin curtains over the windows. I heated a can of food on the stove, ate it in silence at the table, then sat for a long time with nothing but the dim glow of a lantern filling the room. That was when I first noticed it. A sound. It was faint, so faint I almost thought I had imagined it. Came from outside, somewhere in the trees. It sounded like a quick, sharp crack, like a stick snapping under weight. My head turned toward the window immediately. I sat completely still, holding my breath. For a long moment, there was nothing, only silence. Then, just as I was convincing myself it was nothing, I heard another faint crunch. It was far enough away that I couldn't be sure if it was an animal or something else. I tried to tell myself it was just a deer moving through the brush, but the sound came again, steady, like steps. The forest out here was thick, but sound carried strangely. One moment it felt far off, the next it seemed closer. I stood and moved to the window, trying to look out through the trees. It was nearly dark by then, and the forest was nothing but black shapes pressed close together. I waited, staring, but nothing moved. After a while, the sound stopped altogether. I told myself I was letting the silence get to me. It was my first night alone in a place this isolated, and my nerves were playing tricks. I went to bed early, sliding under the blankets, but I lay awake for a long time. The cabin walls were thin, and every gust of wind in the trees outside sounded like movement. Every shifting branch sounded like a footstep. I kept waiting for the sound again, but eventually, sleep pulled me under. When I woke, it was still dark. For a moment, I wasn't sure what had woken me, but then I heard it again, that sound. Crunching, steady, slow, moving somewhere around the cabin. My chest tightened. I stayed still, straining my ears. It circled, or at least it felt like it circled. It would move for a few moments, then stop, then start again from another direction. I sat up in bed, staring at the window. The curtains were thin enough that I could see a faint outline of the trees outside. I didn't move, afraid the sound of the bed frame creaking would give me away. The crunching moved again, this time closer, then paused. Silence stretched out so long I thought it was over. Then the porch creaked. That sound made my stomach drop. The steps outside the cabin were old and loose, and they made a very particular groan under weight. I knew instantly that it wasn't an animal. My throat felt dry as I stared at the door in the darkness, listening. The sound didn't come again. No knock, no attempt at the door. Just silence. Minutes dragged by, but I stayed frozen, watching the faint outline of the window until finally exhaustion overtook fear and I dozed off sitting upright. When daylight came, I forced myself outside. The forest looked harmless in the sun, quiet and still. But when I walked around the cabin, I saw the dirt by the steps was disturbed. The ground was soft from rain earlier in the week, and there were marks in it. Not clear footprints, but impressions like someone had stood there in the night. I spent most of the day pretending it hadn't happened. I walked further into the woods, trying to distract myself. I collected some fallen branches for the stove, cooked another meal, and read a book I had brought. But all the while, my eyes kept drifting to the windows. Every sound outside made my body stiffen. That night, the noises returned. I had been planning the cabin trip for weeks, mostly because I wanted time away from everything. Work had been draining me. The city felt louder and dirtier every day, and I just wanted silence. A friend of mine told me about a small cabin far off a logging road, barely used anymore. It wasn't a rental. It was owned by an older man who let people use it as long as they promised not to leave a mess. I managed to get permission through someone who knew him, and I figured it was exactly what I needed. A few days of isolation, no one around, no traffic, no stress. Just the woods, the smell of pine, and the crackle of a fire at night. I packed simple things. Cans of beans, rice, pasta, oatmeal, jerky, some instant coffee, a flashlight, batteries, a first aid kit, a couple knives, a hatchet, a sleeping bag, some extra clothes, and a heavy coat. I didn't bring much else because I wanted to keep it simple. I thought about bringing my phone, but service didn't reach out that far, so it would only serve as a clock and maybe a flashlight if needed. I left it off most of the time to save the battery in case I needed it for something serious. The road to the cabin was rough. My car could only make it so far before I had to pull over and walk the last stretch with my pack. The trail was muddy, with deep ruts from old trucks that had gone through in wetter months. The trees leaned in over the path, tall and dark, blocking most of the sky. It felt quiet in a way that pressed down on me. I didn't hear birds at first, just the creak of branches above and the sound of my boots sinking into the dirt. When I reached the cabin, I was relieved. It was small, built from old dark wood that looked weathered but sturdy. A metal chimney poked out from the roof, and there was a woodpile stacked against one side. The door was simple, no lock, just a latch. Inside, the cabin was one room with a small wood stove, a cot with a thin mattress, a table with 2 chairs, and a few shelves with old cans and dusty jars. It smelled faintly of mildew and smoke, but it was shelter, and it was mine for the next few days. The first day was calm. I unpacked, set up my sleeping bag on the cot, and gathered firewood from the pile. The stove worked fine once I got a fire going, and soon the cabin was warm. I spent the evening walking the area, following the tree line, checking the little stream about 100 yards away. I filled a pot with water and boiled it on the stove. Everything felt normal, peaceful even. By the time the sun went down, I was tired enough to crawl into my bag and let the fire die slowly. That first night, though, I woke up. I wasn't sure why. The fire had burned out, the cabin was cold, and the dark outside pressed against the single window. I lay there listening. At first, it was only the normal creaks of an old building cooling down. Then I heard something else, a crunch, like a step on frozen ground. I told myself it was an animal, a deer maybe moving through the trees. I held still, listening, and after a few minutes, I heard nothing more. Eventually, I fell back asleep. The next morning, I stepped outside and looked around. Frost covered the ground, and my breath hung in the air. I walked toward the edge of the trees where I thought I had heard the sound. The ground was disturbed, but it was hard to tell what made the prints. They were faint, half-frozen, but they looked more like boots than hooves or paws. I stood there staring at them, uneasy. Maybe a hunter had passed through. That was possible. I told myself it didn't matter. I went on with my day. I chopped more wood, boiled more water, and cooked a little oatmeal. I tried to shake off the thought of the prints, but I kept glancing at the trees. The silence of the place no longer felt comforting. It felt heavy, like it was hiding something. I spent the afternoon walking farther up the trail, trying to clear my mind. The forest was endless, thick with pines and bare branches. The deeper I went, the less I wanted to keep walking. I felt like I was moving farther from safety, so I turned back earlier than I had planned. That night, I built the fire higher and kept it going longer. I stayed up late, sitting at the table, writing in a small notebook I had brought. Around midnight, I heard it again. A crunch, then another, this time closer to the cabin. I froze, my hand resting on the knife I had set on the table. The sound moved slowly around the cabin, like someone circling. My chest tightened, and I forced myself to breathe quietly. Then it stopped. I waited, straining my ears, but the silence returned. I sat there for what felt like hours before finally crawling into my bag. In the morning, I checked again. Around the cabin, I saw more prints. Clearer this time, definitely boots. Not mine. The tracks led from the trees, circled the cabin, and went back into the woods. My stomach turned. Someone had been out there watching, walking around while I sat inside. I considered leaving, packing up and hiking back to the car. But the thought of walking alone down that trail, not knowing who was out there, scared me more than staying. At least in the cabin I had walls, a fire, and a knife. So I told myself I would stay one more night, maybe leave in the morning if I felt the same way. That day, I barely left the cabin. I kept the fire going, boiled more water, and kept my pack close. Ready. Every sound outside made me tense. I thought I saw movement in the trees once, but when I stared, nothing was there. The hours dragged by. When night fell, I felt trapped. I wanted the fire for warmth and light, but I worried it made me too visible. I compromised by letting it burn low, just enough to keep the chill off. I sat on the cot, knife in hand, staring at the door. Hours passed. The dark pressed in. Then I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, right outside. The door creaked softly, not opening, just shifting under weight. I held my breath, muscles locked. Then came a scratch at the wood. Not claws, fingernails dragging lightly. I almost called out, but I knew that would give me away even more. I stayed still, my heart pounding so loud I thought it might give me up. After what felt like forever, the sound stopped. Silence again. I didn't sleep at all that night. By dawn, I made up my mind. I couldn't stay. Whoever it was, they weren't just passing by. They were watching me, playing with me. I packed everything quickly, shoving it into my bag with shaking hands. I didn't even eat. I just doused the fire, slung the pack over my shoulder, and stepped outside. The woods felt colder, sharper. I kept my knife in one hand as I walked. Every sound made me twitch. The trail stretched out ahead, but it felt wrong, as if it had grown longer overnight. I pushed myself, moving fast, not looking back. Then I saw it. In the mud ahead, fresh prints, boots, leading the same way I was going. Someone had been walking that trail recently, maybe only hours before. My chest tightened, but I kept moving. After a while, I noticed something worse. New prints, behind mine. Whoever was out here wasn't just ahead. They were behind me too. I felt trapped in the middle. My hands shook so badly I could barely hold the knife. The trail narrowed, and I pushed through, branches slapping against me. I walked until my legs burned, but I never saw anyone. Just prints ahead and behind. The silence grew heavier, like the forest itself was waiting. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw my car through the trees. Relief surged through me so hard I nearly collapsed. I stumbled to it, yanked open the door, and threw my pack inside. My hands fumbled with the keys, but I got the engine started. As I pulled away, I looked in the rearview mirror. At first, I saw only the trail and the trees. Then I caught movement. A figure stepped out onto the path, just at the edge where the forest opened. They stood there, still, watching as my car bounced away down the road. I couldn't see their face, just the shape of them, tall, unmoving. I didn't slow down. I didn't stop. I drove until I hit pavement, until I saw other cars, until I knew I was miles away. Only then did I let myself breathe again. I never went back to that cabin. I don't know who it was, or why they circled me, or why they followed the trail. All I know is they were out there, in the silence, watching every move I made. And I know that if I had stayed one more night, I might not have made it out. I had rented a cabin deep in the woods, far from the nearest small town, because I wanted quiet for a week. The place sat at the end of a narrow dirt road that wound through thick pine forest. The cabin itself was old but sturdy, built from dark logs that looked like they had been there for decades. It was small, just one main room, a little kitchen, and a bedroom in the back. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and the porch creaked under my boots when I first stepped onto it. I liked that it felt cut off from everything. No neighbors in sight, no cars passing by, and no phone service once I left the highway and drove nearly an hour down that gravel track. At first, the isolation gave me the kind of peace I was looking for. The air smelled sharp with pine, and the only sounds came from wind moving through the trees or the occasional call of a bird. I unpacked my things, a duffel with clothes, a box of food, and a few tools I always carried when staying in remote places. The cabin had power from a small generator, but no internet, which I didn't mind. I thought I would spend the week reading, hiking, and maybe fishing at the river I had seen about half a mile back. The first day passed quietly. I explored the area around the cabin, found an old trail behind it, and followed it for a while until it faded into thick brush. I cooked myself a simple dinner on the old propane stove, then sat on the porch until the sun went down. The forest grew dark quickly, and with no streetlights, the night settled in heavy and complete. The only light came from the moon above the tree line and the glow from inside the cabin. I slept fine that night. The mattress in the bedroom was thin and creaky, but it was enough. I woke once when I thought I heard something brushing against the outside wall, but after a few minutes of listening, I told myself it was just branches shifting in the wind. The second day I kept busy. I walked to the river, carrying a small pack with water and some food, and spent most of the day there. The water was clear and cold, moving over smooth rocks. I sat near the bank, skipping stones and eating my lunch. On the way back, I noticed some faint tire marks along the dirt road near the turnoff to the cabin. Not fresh, but not very old either. I figured someone else had come down this way recently, maybe hunters or someone cutting wood. It didn't mean much. Back at the cabin, I chopped a little firewood, though there was already a stack on the porch. The quiet of the place started to feel heavier than before. Not in a bad way yet, just more noticeable. Every sound stood out. A snapping twig somewhere behind the cabin made me pause and look, though I saw nothing but trees. That evening, while I was cooking, I noticed something strange. On the kitchen counter, near the window, there were wet marks, small round spots that looked like water dripped from above. But there was no leak, no damp patch on the ceiling. The marks weren't there earlier when I unpacked. I wiped them away with a cloth and forgot about it for the moment, though the details stayed in my mind. That night, I had a harder time sleeping. I kept hearing faint noises outside, not loud, just soft movements. Once it sounded like something brushing against the porch rail. Another time I thought I heard gravel crunching lightly, like footsteps. Every time I got up and looked through the window, I saw only darkness and trees. Eventually I drifted off, though it was restless. The third day was colder. Clouds moved in, and the wind blew harder through the trees. I spent more time inside, reading a book I had brought. Around late afternoon, I decided to walk a short way down the dirt road to stretch my legs. That was when I noticed something that unsettled me. About 20 yards from the cabin, near the edge of the road, there were clear footprints in the dirt. They weren't mine. I could see the tread pattern, and it wasn't from my boots. The prints looked fresh, pressed sharp into the damp ground from last night's dew. I stood there a long time staring at them. They came from the direction of the road and stopped not far from the cabin, as if someone had walked toward it, then turned back. My first thought was that maybe it was a hunter or someone curious, but the prints led close enough that whoever made them could have seen the cabin clearly. I didn't like that they stopped short, as if the person had stood there watching. Back inside, I locked the door. I kept busy with small tasks, but I couldn't shake the thought of those footprints. When night fell, the wind died down, and the silence pressed in heavier than before. I lit a fire in the old wood stove, and its crackle filled the cabin. Still, I couldn't relax. I kept thinking about the possibility that someone else was nearby, maybe coming back after dark. I slept very little that night. Every creak in the cabin, every sound outside kept me awake. At one point, I was sure I heard soft steps on the porch. I lay still in bed, barely breathing, waiting to hear more. After what felt like forever, the sound faded. When I finally forced myself up and checked the door, the lock was still in place. In the morning, I found something that made my stomach tighten. On the porch rail, clear as day, were fingerprints in the thin layer of dust. They were smudged, but unmistakable. Someone had been there, leaning or holding onto the rail during the night. The rest of the day, I felt on edge. I walked the property slowly, checking around the cabin. I didn't find anyone, but I saw another set of footprints behind the cabin, faint but fresh enough to tell they were recent. Whoever it was had circled the place. I thought about leaving right then, driving back to town, but something in me resisted the idea. I told myself it was probably nothing more than someone curious or maybe lost, and that leaving early would feel like giving in to fear. Still, I couldn't ignore the unease that grew heavier each hour. That evening, I cooked quickly, barely tasting my food, and made sure every door and window was locked. I kept a hatchet within reach and sat in the main room with the fire going. I turned off the lights, hoping it would make it harder for anyone outside to see me. When the night deepened, I heard it again. Soft, careful steps, this time unmistakable. They moved slowly around the cabin, pausing often, as if the person was listening or looking. My chest tightened, and I sat frozen, gripping the hatchet. I didn't move for almost an hour while the sounds came and went around the cabin. Finally, silence settled in again, but I didn't sleep at all that night. By the 5th day, I was running on little rest. My nerves felt raw. Every sound made me jump. In daylight, I checked the ground again and saw more prints, now fresher and closer. They had come right up to the side window, the one near the kitchen. I saw faint smudges on the glass itself, as if someone had pressed against it to look inside. That was when I decided I couldn't stay. I packed my bag quickly, stuffed food and clothes inside, and carried it out to the truck. The air outside felt heavy, the trees too still. I loaded everything, climbed in, and turned the key. The engine coughed, sputtered, then died. I tried again. Nothing. The battery was dead, though I had used the truck just a few days earlier with no problem. A sick feeling spread through me. It didn't make sense that the battery would fail so suddenly. I popped the hood, looked at the connections, and froze. The cables had been cut clean through. Someone had been under the hood while I was inside the cabin. I knew then that whoever was watching wasn't just wandering or curious. They wanted me stuck out there. I dragged my bag back inside, locked the door, and sat down hard. My mind raced with what to do. The nearest town was miles away, and walking the road meant being exposed the whole time. With no phone service, I couldn't call for help. I thought of trying to hike through the woods to the highway, but I had no idea how far it really was. That night was the longest of my life. I stayed in the dark, sitting in the main room with the hatchet in my lap, every muscle tight. Around midnight, I heard the porch creak. Slow, deliberate steps moved closer to the door. The handle rattled softly once, then again. I held my breath, staring at the door. The lock held, and after a long pause, the steps moved away. The next morning, I searched again for signs, and they were everywhere. More prints, more smudges on windows, even marks on the back door where someone had tried to pry it open. Whoever it was, they weren't going away. I spent the day preparing. I blocked the doors with furniture, stacked wood by the windows, and filled a bag with essentials in case I had to run. I barely ate, barely drank. The forest felt wrong now, not peaceful at all, just a wall of cover where someone could wait unseen. That night, the attack came. I woke to the sound of glass breaking in the kitchen. My body jolted with adrenaline, and I grabbed the hatchet, heart slamming against my ribs. I moved as quietly as I could, staying low, and saw a dark shape climbing through the broken window. I didn't wait. I charged forward, swinging the hatchet with all the strength I had. The blade hit wood as the figure ducked, striking the frame instead. The intruder shoved hard, knocking me back, and scrambled fully inside. In the dim light, I saw just enough. Tall, broad shoulders, face hidden by a hood. I ran for the bedroom, slammed the door, and shoved. I never thought I would spend more than a few nights in that cabin. It wasn't built for comfort. It wasn't even mine. It belonged to a friend of a friend who told me I could use it while I needed a quiet place to work through some things. The cabin was small, hidden in a thick patch of woods, a couple of hours from the nearest town. There was a dirt road that wound through the trees and stopped a few yards from the front steps. Beyond that, the forest stretched for miles, the kind of woods where once you stepped in too far, every direction looked the same. I arrived in late afternoon with the trunk of my car packed tight. I brought canned food, bottled water, some basic tools, and a sleeping bag since I knew the old bed inside would probably be too stiff to sleep on. The air felt cool and damp when I stepped out, and the woods were quiet in that way that makes you immediately aware of how far you are from anyone else. No sounds of cars, no voices, no distant hum of power lines. Just trees standing still, branches creaking when the wind pushed through. The cabin itself leaned slightly, the roof sagging in the middle. The wood siding had turned gray from years of rain and sun, and the front steps groaned under my weight. Inside, it smelled like old pine and dust. There was one main room with a small kitchen counter, a table, and a bed pushed against the wall. The back had a tiny bathroom with a cracked mirror and a toilet that didn't flush properly unless I poured water into the tank from a bucket. It wasn't much, but I figured it would work. First, it was peaceful. I spent the days walking along the trails, splitting firewood, and writing in a notebook. Nights were harder. The silence pressed in around the cabin. Even the smallest sound, like a branch snapping outside, seemed sharp and close. The windows didn't have curtains, so when I lay down at night, I felt exposed. The forest pressed against the glass, black and endless, and I could never shake the feeling that something might be standing out there, just beyond the reach of the moonlight. The first few nights passed without much trouble. I kept a lantern burning inside, and I locked the door even though the lock was just a thin metal latch that could be broken with a hard shove. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was only jumpy because I wasn't used to the quiet. But then things started happening. It began with little things I almost convinced myself I had imagined. One morning, I stepped outside and noticed footprints in the dirt near the cabin. They weren't mine. They circled the cabin and stopped by the back window. They were clear enough that I could see the tread of a boot, heavier and wider than mine. At first, I told myself maybe it was from before. Maybe someone had been here recently and I just hadn't noticed. But the soil had been soft from rain the night before. These prints were fresh. I spent the whole day unsettled. Every sound from the woods pulled my eyes away from what I was doing. A woodpecker hammering on a tree made me flinch. I walked around the cabin several times, trying to convince myself nobody was around. The forest was thick, but I didn't see or hear anyone. That night, I hardly slept. I kept waking up and listening. I thought I heard movement outside, slow steps in the leaves, but I could never be sure. The lantern burned low, and every shadow on the walls made me think of someone standing outside the window, waiting. By the third night, I was certain someone was watching the cabin. It was just after midnight when I woke to a sound at the window. It wasn't loud, just the faintest scrape, but it froze me. I didn't move at first. My body stiffened under the sleeping bag, and my eyes fixed on the dark square of glass across the room. I couldn't see anything outside, only the faint outline of branches moving in the wind. But the sound came again, slower this time, like a finger dragging across the glass. I waited, holding my breath, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Then silence. I didn't hear footsteps walking away, no sound of movement at all, just silence. The next morning, I went outside and checked the window. The dirt beneath it was disturbed, and I saw another set of boot prints. They weren't mine. Whoever it was had come back. From then on, everything changed. I started keeping a hatchet with me at all times, even when I sat inside. I checked the windows constantly. I stopped taking long walks in the woods because I felt like if I went too far, I would come back to find someone waiting in the cabin. My mind stayed sharp and wired all the time, listening for the slightest sound. It only got worse. One night, as I lay awake listening, I heard it, clear as day. A slow step on the porch. The boards creaked under the weight. Then another step. My whole body went cold. Whoever it was stopped right outside the door. I waited for the knock or the sound of the latch rattling, but nothing happened. Just silence. I didn't move. I stayed frozen until dawn crept through the trees. When I finally worked up the courage to open the door, I saw it. A single muddy boot print pressed into the wood of the porch. By then I knew I couldn't stay long, but leaving wasn't so simple. The dirt road back out was rough, and my car had already struggled coming in. If I left in a rush at night, I risked getting stuck. And there was a part of me that didn't want to leave in panic, didn't want to feel like whoever was out there had chased me off. Still, I began preparing. I kept my bags packed. I rationed my food, telling myself I'd only need to last a couple more days. But the nights kept getting worse. One night, I woke to a sound that made my blood run cold. It was the unmistakable sound of the door latch moving, slow and careful. I sat up, gripping the hatchet, staring at the door in the dim lantern light. The latch rattled again, just barely. Then silence. I didn't sleep again until the sun rose. When I checked the door in the morning, I saw scratches around the latch, like someone had tried to pry it open with a tool. That was the moment I knew I couldn't stay another night. I spent the day checking the car, making sure it would start. I packed everything tightly. I decided I would leave at first light when I had the best chance of making it out safely. That final night was the longest of my life. I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the chair with the hatchet across my lap, lantern burning low. The forest outside was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. Hours passed, and then, sometime after midnight, it happened again. The sound of footsteps in the leaves, slow, steady, circling the cabin. My breath caught in my throat. The steps stopped outside the window, the same one they always came to. I didn't move. My hands clenched the hatchet so tightly my knuckles ached. Then came the sound I feared most, the creak of the porch steps. Whoever it was moved carefully, step by step, until they stood just outside the door. I could hear the faint sound of breathing, low and steady, on the other side of the wood. I sat frozen for what felt like forever, waiting for the door to burst open. But it never did. After a long silence, the steps retreated, slow and deliberate, back into the woods. I didn't move until the first light of morning. When the sun finally rose, I carried my bags to the car, heart racing the whole time. The forest was still, empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I shoved everything inside, turned the key, and the engine roared to life. As I pulled away, I glanced back at the cabin one last time. That's when I saw it, nailed to the porch post, a small strip of cloth. It wasn't there before. It looked torn from a jacket, dark and dirty. Whoever had been out there wanted me to know they'd been close enough to leave it. I drove until I reached the highway, not stopping once, not even for gas, until the tank was almost empty. I never went back to that cabin. I never told my friend what happened, but the image of that cloth, swaying in the morning breeze, stays in my mind. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't some story. It was a person, flesh and blood, who had been outside that cabin night after night, circling, watching, waiting. And the worst part is knowing I'll never know why. I had been needing a break from everything for months. Life in the city had worn me down more than I realized. The endless noise, the traffic, the constant buzzing of people and machines left me restless even at night. I couldn't sleep properly, couldn't focus, and it felt like my mind was stuck in a loop that just kept running without pause. I wanted quiet. I wanted space. So when I found a listing for a cabin rental out in the woods, miles from the nearest small town, I booked it without overthinking. The photos made it look simple but good enough. A small wooden structure, tucked in a clearing with trees all around it. A gravel road led there, according to the host, but he warned that cell service would be non-existent and that I should bring everything I needed because the nearest store was a 40-minute drive away. That didn't bother me. In fact, that was what I wanted. I told myself a week in a quiet cabin would reset me. I arrived in the late afternoon. The road was narrower than I expected, just gravel pressed into dirt, winding through miles of thick forest. My car rattled as I drove over potholes and uneven patches. The trees stood tall on both sides, their branches crowding together over the road so that sunlight only made its way down in patches. I kept thinking if I broke down here, no one would know. That feeling stuck with me more than I wanted to admit. When I finally pulled up, the cabin looked smaller than in the photos. Just one level, built of old timber, the paint long faded into dull brown. The clearing around it was uneven, with patches of tall grass and weeds that looked like they hadn't been cut in months. To the left side was a small wooden shed. The cabin's windows were dark, almost too dark, but the front porch was wide and had a bench. The forest pressed in close behind it like a wall. Inside, it was what I expected. A single main room with a small kitchen on one side, a sofa, and a wood stove. There was one bedroom with a bed and a bathroom with a weak-looking shower. It smelled faintly of dust and old wood, but it wasn't unbearable. I carried in my bags and groceries and stacked them neatly. I wanted to keep things organized, to keep some sense of control in a place like this. The first night was quiet, almost too quiet. In the city, there was always some hum in the background. Here, when I shut off the lights, the silence pressed against me. I lay on the bed staring at the ceiling, listening to small creaks in the wood and the occasional snap of a branch outside. Every sound stood out. I told myself it was just nature. The next day, I walked the clearing and around the cabin. I checked the shed but found it empty except for some old tools, a broken chair, and a rusted metal can. The trees grew thick and dense around the clearing, the kind of forest you couldn't easily walk through without pushing branches aside or tripping on roots. I didn't go too far in, just enough to see how quickly the cabin disappeared from view if you stepped between the trees. That unsettled me. For 2 days, things were fine. I cooked, I read, I sat on the porch, and I walked the edge of the clearing. At night, I sat by the stove with a single lamp on and wrote in my notebook. I told myself I was finally breathing again. But on the third night, I woke up to a sound. It was faint but sharp enough to cut through my sleep. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I realized it wasn't. It was footsteps, slow, deliberate steps on the wooden porch outside. I froze in the bed, staring at the ceiling, my body stiff. I kept listening. The steps moved across the boards, pausing near the door, then continued to the far end of the porch. I waited for a knock or the sound of the door opening, but nothing happened. I lay there for hours, listening, until sleep finally forced itself on me. In the morning, I checked the porch. Nothing was there. The boards looked the same, no sign of tracks, no mud, nothing. I told myself maybe I dreamed it, that my mind invented it in the silence. That night, it happened again. This time, I stayed awake. Around 2 in the morning, I heard them. Slow steps on the porch. They moved from one side to the other, back and forth, like someone pacing. I didn't move from the bed. I barely even breathed. My phone had no service, so calling anyone wasn't an option. I thought about grabbing one of the kitchen knives, but I couldn't make myself get up. After an hour, the steps stopped. I stayed awake until the first light came through the window. I walked outside as soon as it was morning. Again, nothing. The ground around the cabin was soft in places from recent rain, but I didn't see any fresh footprints. It didn't make sense. If someone was out there, there should have been some trace. By the 5th night, I hadn't slept more than a few hours total. I sat up in bed, waiting. 2:15 exactly, the steps began. This time, I got up quietly and walked to the front window. I pulled the curtain just slightly aside. My heart pounded so hard I thought I'd lose control of myself. But there was nothing. The porch was empty. I could hear the boards creaking, but I couldn't see anyone. The sound moved across the porch from one end to the other. The wood dipped as if weight pressed down on it, but the boards themselves looked untouched. My stomach turned. I sat there all night listening. In the morning, I checked every inch of the cabin. The doors were still locked. The windows were closed. I went back out to the shed, wondering if someone was hiding inside, but it was just as empty as before. I even walked 30 yards into the trees, circling the cabin, scanning for signs of someone camping nearby. Nothing. The days blurred after that. I barely ate, just kept waiting for night. Every night, the steps came back. Always around the same time, always the same pace. Sometimes they stopped near the door for minutes, like whoever it was stood listening. I started piling furniture against the front door, even though the lock worked. I put a chair under the bedroom doorknob. It didn't help me sleep. On the 8th night, I snapped. I sat in the dark with one of the kitchen knives in my hand, waiting. When the steps started, I jumped to the door and yanked it open, knife raised. The porch was empty. The clearing was empty. The sound stopped instantly, like it had never been there. I stood there in the doorway, knife shaking in my hand, the cold air biting at me. I stayed up until dawn on the porch. Nothing moved. When the light came, I noticed something I hadn't before. On the far corner of the porch, one board was slightly darker than the rest, like it had been damp more recently. The wood looked more worn too, like it had been stepped on far more times than the others. That day, I didn't know what to do. I couldn't call anyone, couldn't prove anything, couldn't even be sure I wasn't losing my mind. But I knew I couldn't stay another night. I packed my bags, loaded the car, and drove out without looking back. When I reached the town, my phone lit up with service again. I sat in the parking lot of a gas station, staring at the signal bars, but I didn't call the owner, didn't report anything. What would I say? That footsteps walked across the porch every night without anyone there? No one would believe that. For weeks after, I kept hearing it in my head at night. Slow, heavy steps crossing wood, pausing at the door, pacing back and forth. I never went back to that cabin. I didn't even ask for a refund. I just wanted it to be over, but it hasn't ended. Even now, months later, when I wake up in the middle of the night in my apartment, I sometimes think I hear it again. Faint creaks of wood, as if someone is walking across a porch that isn't there. And the worst part is, I can't tell if it's still in my head, or if whoever was out there followed me back. I drove out to the cabin later than I had planned. The sky was already dimming when I left the main road, and the dirt path leading into the trees was full of ruts from old tires. The cabin was small and plain, something I had rented for a week to get away from work and noise. I thought the quiet would help me reset. It was a place with no phone service, no neighbors close by, and no easy way for anyone to reach me unless they knew exactly where to go. At first, that felt like peace, but the further I drove into the thick woods, the more it felt like a warning. The cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by tall pines that leaned over as if they were closing me in. The wood of the walls was gray and weathered, the porch sagged a little, and the single window facing the driveway was dark. The lock on the front door worked fine, and inside there was only one main room with a bed, a table, and a small stove. I set my bag down and lit a lantern since the electric light was weak and flickered sometimes. The first thing I noticed was the smell, like old wood mixed with damp earth. I tried to settle in that first night by unpacking and making a small meal. Outside, the woods were so quiet that every small sound felt louder. A branch breaking, wind brushing against the side of the cabin, the roof creaking as it cooled down from the day's heat. All of it made me notice how alone I really was. When I turned off the lantern to lie down, the darkness was so deep that it pressed against me. I couldn't see the outlines of the walls. I thought about how far I was from anyone else. If something happened, no one would hear me. I tried not to think about that, but the thought stayed in the back of my mind as I lay still, staring at nothing. The next morning, I decided to walk around the clearing to get comfortable with my surroundings. The ground was uneven, full of pine needles and old stumps. Behind the cabin, the woods thickened fast, and after only a short walk, I realized how easy it would be to get lost if I went too far. I didn't want to wander deep in, so I stuck close. When I came back, I noticed something strange in the dirt near the porch. There were marks that didn't look like animal tracks. They looked like shoe prints. At first, I thought maybe they were mine from when I walked around the evening before, but they were bigger and deeper, like someone heavier had been standing there for a while. I brushed it off. Maybe they were older, left by whoever maintained the place. Still, I felt uneasy knowing they were there. That night, the quiet felt sharper. I lay in bed listening to the woods. Around midnight, I thought I heard something soft outside the cabin. A slow, dragging sound, like someone walking close to the wall. My chest tightened, and I held my breath, waiting. It went away after a few seconds, but I didn't sleep much after that. The next days passed slowly. I tried to distract myself with simple routines. Cooking, walking around, reading an old book I had brought. But each time I stepped outside, I felt like the woods were heavier, as if someone was watching from between the trees. One afternoon, I noticed that something in the cabin had been moved. I had left my bag zipped shut near the table, but now it was partly open. Nothing was missing, but I knew I hadn't left it like that. I tried to explain it away as me being careless, but it stuck in my head. That night, the sound outside came again. This time, it wasn't just dragging. It was slow steps circling the cabin. The boards of the porch creaked under weight. My throat was dry, and I gripped the lantern but didn't light it, afraid the glow would show me inside. I waited, heart pounding, until the sounds stopped. When morning came, I checked the porch. More footprints, clearer this time. A man's boots, fresh. I knew they weren't mine. It became clear I wasn't alone in the woods. Someone was coming near the cabin at night. I didn't know if they were trying to scare me, rob me, or worse. I had no way to call for help. No way to leave quickly in the dark without risking crashing my car on the rough path. I started trying to stay awake longer into the night. I sat at the table with the lantern off, listening. Sometimes I thought I heard breathing near the walls, or the crunch of leaves just past the porch. Once I thought I saw a shadow pass by the window, but it was so quick I couldn't be sure. I started to set little signs for myself. I leaned a stick against the porch railing so I would know if it had been touched. I placed small stones in a line by the steps. Each morning, something was different. The stick would be knocked down. The stones scattered. The fear settled deep into me. I couldn't focus on anything else. I was trapped between leaving too soon, in the dark, or waiting it out until daylight but giving whoever was out there more time to get closer. On the 5th night, it escalated. I was lying on the bed, eyes wide open, when I heard the unmistakable sound of the doorknob turning. It rattled softly, then harder, as if someone was testing it. My heart slammed in my chest. I froze, afraid even to breathe. The knob stopped moving after a few moments, but then the sound of slow, heavy steps crossed the porch. I heard someone crouch down against the wall. There was no mistaking it now. Someone was right outside, inches from where I lay. I waited for what felt like an hour, but it was probably minutes. Every creak of the wood, every shift in the air made me think they were about to come in. My body was stiff, my mind racing through what I could do if the door opened. I had nothing but a kitchen knife, and even that felt useless against whoever was out there. Finally, the steps moved away. The silence that followed was almost worse. I didn't know if they had left or if they were waiting just beyond the trees. By dawn, I had made up my mind. I couldn't stay another night. As soon as the light was strong enough, I packed everything quickly. My hands shook as I stuffed clothes into my bag. I didn't bother with food or cleaning up. I just wanted to get out. When I stepped outside, the cold air hit me, and I saw the porch more clearly. The footprints were everywhere. Clear boot prints pacing back and forth, up and down the steps, circling the cabin again and again. They weren't the random steps of someone passing by. They showed someone had stayed there for hours, moving around while I was inside. I shoved my bag in the car and started it as fast as I could. The engine roared louder than I expected, and for a moment I was terrified the sound would draw whoever it was out of the trees. I kept looking at the woods, waiting to see a figure step out, but nothing moved. The drive out felt endless. Every bump in the dirt road made me think I was being followed. I didn't relax until I hit the paved road and finally saw other cars in the distance. By the time I reached the nearest town, the fear hadn't left me. I stopped at a gas station and just sat in the car for a long time, staring at nothing. I thought about how close it had been, how someone had stood just outside the cabin while I tried to sleep. I thought about how they had touched the doorknob, tried to get in, and only the lock had stopped them. That was when it sank in. If I had stayed longer, if I had ignored the signs or told myself it was all in my head, they might have found a way inside. Maybe they were waiting for me to get careless. Maybe they wanted to see how long they could keep me trapped in fear before they finally made their move. I didn't go back for the rest of the week I had paid for. I didn't even go back to get the small things I had left behind. Couldn't. The thought of stepping into that clearing again made my stomach twist. Even now, I remember the sound of the doorknob rattling in the dark and the heavy silence that followed. I don't know who was out there or what they wanted, but I know I was never really alone in that cabin. And I know leaving when I did might have been the only thing that kept me safe. I had gone up to the cabin to be alone for a while. It was late autumn, the kind of time when the air outside is crisp enough to sting your lungs, but still not yet buried under heavy snow. The leaves were mostly gone from the trees, only a few brown ones left clinging to thin branches that rattled in the wind. I had been planning this trip for weeks, just me and the cabin, a chance to get away from noise and people. The place was far from the nearest town, about 20 miles down a narrow road that was more dirt than gravel. The last time anyone had used it regularly was probably years ago, and even then, it must have been hard to maintain. The cabin itself was old. It sat in a small clearing, built from thick logs that were now weathered gray from decades of rain and sun. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, though it still kept out the weather. Inside, there was only what I needed: a wood stove, a small table, a narrow bed with a thin mattress, and a few shelves where I had stacked some cans of food I brought. I also had a small generator, just enough to run a single bulb at night, though I tried not to use it much. I liked the quiet, the way the darkness outside pressed against the windows and made me feel cut off from everything else. The first couple of days went the way I expected. I chopped wood, walked around the clearing, and cooked simple meals. At night, I sat near the wood stove and listened to the fire crackle. The silence out there was different from anything back in town. It wasn't really silence. It was filled with small noises, branches snapping, wind moving through the trees, and the occasional distant cry of an animal. First, it was soothing. Then it started to feel heavier, as if the woods were pressing closer every time I looked out a window. It was on the third night that I noticed something strange. I had been inside all day because the sky had stayed gray and heavy, spitting cold drizzle on and off. By the time night fell, I was already tired. I made myself a meal from a can and sat down at the table. That was when I heard a sound outside. It was faint, just the crunch of leaves, but it was steady, not like the random fall of branches. It sounded like footsteps. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer moving through the clearing. But the sound kept going, slow and measured, circling. I set down my fork and listened. The steps moved behind the cabin, then to the side, then stopped. I waited, staring at the window, but the sound didn't come again. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was nothing. The woods could play tricks on your ears. I tried to eat again, but I realized my hands were shaking a little. That night, when I lay in bed, I couldn't sleep. Every small creak of the cabin made me sit up and hold my breath. At some point, I thought I heard a faint scraping sound near the back wall, like something dragging lightly across the wood. I stayed still for what felt like an hour, staring at the ceiling until finally exhaustion pulled me under. The next morning, I walked around outside. I wasn't really sure what I was looking for, but I found something that made my stomach tighten. Near the side of the cabin, in the wet ground where the rain had softened the dirt, there were prints. They weren't animal tracks. They were from boots. They circled the cabin, just like I thought I heard. The prints were deep enough to show clearly, and they were fresh. Someone had been out there in the night walking around my cabin. I stood there for a long time just staring at them. My first thought was that maybe it was a hunter, someone passing through. But hunters don't walk in circles around a cabin without knocking. Not in the middle of the night. I tried to think of any other reason, but none made sense. Someone had been there, and they didn't want me to know it. The rest of the day, I couldn't focus on anything. Every noise from the woods made me flinch. I thought about leaving, packing up and driving back into town, but I pushed the thought away. I told myself it was nothing, just some stranger who had already moved on. Still, as the sun dropped lower, I felt a kind of dread building in me. That night, I decided not to use the generator. I kept the cabin dark except for the faint light of the fire in the stove. I sat in a chair with my back to the wall, facing the front window, listening. Hours went by like that. The wind picked up, and the trees groaned. I started to think maybe I had imagined the prints. Maybe I had overreacted. But then, sometime after midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps. They were slow, careful. Whoever it was must have thought the cabin was dark and empty. The steps came up from the side, then toward the back. I sat frozen in my chair, my whole body tense. The sound stopped, and the silence felt heavier than before. Then there was another noise, a soft push against one of the windows, as if someone was testing it. My heart hammered in my chest. I didn't move, didn't even breathe too loud. After a long minute, the sound stopped. Then the footsteps moved away into the woods. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just sat there until the first gray light of morning touched the trees. When I finally stepped outside, the air was sharp and cold. I looked around the clearing and saw the prints again, More of them this time, circling close to the windows. Whoever it was, they had come right up to the glass. The rest of the day, I tried to think of what to do. The road was long, and my truck was parked a little way down the trail because I hadn't wanted to tear up the clearing. That meant I'd have to walk through the trees just to reach it. The thought of being out there, alone with someone hiding in the woods, made my skin crawl. At the same time, staying in the cabin felt like waiting for something worse. That evening, I made a plan. I stacked wood against the doors to make them harder to open. I kept my axe within reach. I didn't use any light at all. I sat again with my back to the wall, staring into the dark. My nerves were stretched so tight that every crack and pop from the fire made me jump. Hours went by, but eventually the sound returned. This time it wasn't just footsteps. I heard the crunch of leaves, then the scrape of metal on wood. Someone was trying the door. Slowly, quietly, the handle rattled. The sound filled the cabin, louder than anything I had ever heard. I gripped the axe so hard my hands hurt. The door didn't open, but the sound went on for what felt like forever. Then it stopped. Silence again. I waited, barely breathing. Minutes crawled past. Then I heard something heavier. A thud against the wall, low to the ground, like a shoulder being pressed into it. Another thud followed, harder this time. They were testing the walls, the strength of the cabin itself. My mind raced with thoughts I didn't want. What if they had a weapon? What if they set the cabin on fire? What if they just kept waiting until I made a mistake? Eventually, the sounds faded. I sat there until the sky outside lightened again. When I opened the door, the cold morning air hit me like ice. The ground outside the door was a mess of prints, deep and chaotic, as if the person had stood there for a long time, shifting, testing. That was when I made my decision. I couldn't stay. Whoever was out there wasn't going away, and they weren't just passing by. They wanted something, and I was alone, cut off with no way to call for help. I packed quickly. I shoved food and water into my bag, strapped on my boots, and gripped the axe in one hand. Every step outside the cabin felt exposed, but I forced myself down the narrow path toward where the truck was parked. The woods pressed close around me, every tree a possible hiding place. My ears strained for any sound, but all I heard was the crunch of my own footsteps. When I reached the truck, I almost cried with relief. I climbed in, started it up, and pulled onto the rough trail. As I drove, I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see someone running out of the trees behind me. But the road stayed empty. Mile after mile, I pushed the truck as fast as it would go, bouncing over ruts and rocks, until finally the forest thinned and I reached the highway. Only then did I let myself breathe fully. The cabin was far behind me, but the thought of those footprints circling it stayed sharp in my mind. Whoever it was, they had been patient. They had come night after night, testing, waiting. If I had stayed longer, if I had made one mistake, I don't think I would have walked away. I never went back to that cabin. Even now, when I think about it, I wonder who was out there, what they wanted, and how much longer they would have waited if I hadn't left when I did. I had been planning the cabin trip for weeks, and when the day finally came, I loaded my truck with all the basics I thought I would need. The drive took me deep into the forest, far away from the town, where the road turned narrow and gravelly, the tall trees closing in on both sides until it felt like I was driving through a tunnel of green and shadow. The cabin I had rented was not big or fancy, just an old wooden place tucked against a hill, with a small clearing in the front and the forest stretching endlessly behind it. I liked the quiet. I wanted the break from noise, screens, and people. My plan was simple: stay alone, hike a little, read, and rest. The cabin had a small porch, one rocking chair, a wood stove inside, and the kind of smell that old cabins usually carry, a mixture of wood, dust, and dampness. There was no electricity, only a couple of lanterns and candles, and no cell signal either. That isolation was what had drawn me to the place. The first day went the way I wanted. I unloaded my gear, stacked firewood against the wall, boiled some water on the stove, and watched the sun sink through the trees. The nights got dark fast there, darker than what I was used to. When the sun disappeared, the woods went completely black, and the only sounds were crickets, the occasional owl, and the popping of the fire inside. It was quiet in a way that pressed in on you, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. On the second day, I decided to walk a little deeper into the forest, following no real trail, just moving between the trees. The ground was soft with fallen leaves, and the air was cool. After about an hour, I came across something I hadn't expected. It was another cabin, older and clearly abandoned. Its roof had partly caved in, and the windows were broken. Weeds had grown up through the steps, and the door was hanging crooked. I stood there for a while, staring at it, trying to imagine who had built it and when it had last been used. Something about it gave me a strange feeling, though nothing I could explain. I went closer and peeked through the doorway. Inside, the floorboards were warped, and there was an old metal bed frame in one corner with the mattress long rotted away. A rusted lantern sat on the floor, and some broken chairs were scattered near the hearth. I didn't stay long. The air inside smelled sour, and the place felt heavy, as if it had been sealed in its own silence for too many years. When I got back to my cabin, I tried to shake off the unease. I cooked some simple food, chopped more wood, and as night came down again, I sat on the porch with the lantern glowing beside me. That was when I noticed something unusual. Across the clearing, near the edge of the woods, I thought I saw movement. Just a shadow at first, but it seemed too steady to be just branches moving. It was tall, upright. I stared, trying to see clearly, but when I blinked, it was gone. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a deer. Still, I felt the back of my neck prickle. I went inside, slid the wooden bar across the door, and tried to focus on the fire. The sound of the forest felt different now, every crack of a twig or rustle of leaves pulling at my attention. I stayed up late that night, waiting for sleep to come, but every time I closed my eyes, I pictured that shadow standing just beyond the trees. The next morning, I tried to be practical about it. I told myself the woods were full of animals, and that was all it could have been. To clear my head, I went for another hike, this time in a different direction, making sure I could always find my way back. I carried a small hunting knife at my belt, more for comfort than for use, and I kept glancing behind me as I walked. About half a mile out, I found something odd. There were footprints in the dirt, human ones, fresh. They weren't mine. They led off into the trees and disappeared, but the sight of them made my stomach sink. I hadn't seen anyone since I got there, and as far as I knew, this land wasn't busy with other visitors. I followed the tracks a short way but stopped when I realized how easily I could lose myself if I went too far. Instead, I turned back to the cabin, and all the while I felt watched. I couldn't shake the idea that someone else was out there. That night was worse. I kept the lantern burning inside and lay in bed listening. At some point, long after midnight, I heard it. The crunch of footsteps outside on the leaves. They were slow, deliberate, circling. I held my breath, every muscle locked. The steps stopped, then started again, closer this time, near the porch. I could picture someone standing just beyond the door. I didn't move. I gripped the handle of my knife under the blanket and waited. The footsteps faded after a while, but I never heard them move away fully. I stayed awake until dawn, my throat dry and my body heavy with fear. When the light finally came, I checked outside. There were marks in the dirt, not animal tracks this time, but the clear imprint of boots. They came up from the trees, circled the cabin, and stopped at the porch steps. Whoever it was had been right there, only a few feet away from me as I lay inside. I spent that day in a fog, unsure of what to do. There was no cell service, and the nearest town was hours away. I thought about leaving, but the idea of walking back to my truck through miles of woods while someone was out there felt just as dangerous. I decided to wait one more day, but I kept the knife with me everywhere I went. By the fourth night, I was unraveling. I sat with the lantern low, trying to stay calm, when I heard something again. This time, it wasn't just footsteps. There was a sound at the window, a soft scraping, as if a hand or object brushed against the glass. I froze, staring at the shadows flickering across the walls. The scraping stopped, then the porch creaked under weight. I moved slowly to the window, careful not to show myself in the light. Through the small gap at the curtain, I saw him. A man, tall, thin, his face partly hidden by a hood. He stood on the porch, looking at the door, not moving. My heart hammered so hard I thought it would shake the walls. He stayed there for what felt like forever, then finally stepped off and melted back into the trees. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I knew I couldn't stay. I packed quickly, throwing everything into my bag, and made for the trail that led back to my truck. My ears strained for any sound, and my eyes scanned the trees constantly. At one point, I caught sight of him again, far behind me, just a shape moving through the woods. He was following. I pushed harder, nearly running, until my legs ached and my chest burned. When I finally reached the truck, I yanked the door open, started the engine, and drove fast down the gravel road, not looking back until the trees thinned and the road widened. Only then did I breathe fully again. I didn't stop until I was miles away, until the cabin and the woods were far behind me. I never reported it. I couldn't explain it well, and part of me didn't want to relive it. But I know what I saw, what I heard, and I know there was someone out there in those woods watching me, circling me, waiting. I never went back. I had been planning the trip for a while. I wanted some time away from everything. Work, city noise, traffic, the constant ringing of my phone. It had all piled up, and I was tired. A friend of mine had mentioned a small cabin he once rented up in the woods near a lake. He said it was simple but private, and that was what I wanted most. I wanted to be alone, to breathe fresh air, to hear silence. When I arrived, it was late afternoon. The cabin was small, built out of old wood, sitting in a clearing surrounded by tall trees. The gravel road that led there ended right at the cabin, and from that point on it was only forest. The air was cooler than in the city, and I remember standing there for a while, listening. I could hear the distant sound of water running, probably a stream, and birds. There were no cars, no voices, no machines, just quiet. Inside, the cabin was plain. One room with a bed in the corner, a table, 2 chairs, a wood stove, and a small counter with some shelves. There was no electricity, no running water. I had brought supplies with me, enough food for several days, a lantern, and some extra batteries. I had planned to use the trip to relax, maybe read, write in my notebook, and go for walks. The first day was peaceful. I unpacked my things, made a simple dinner on a camping stove I had brought, and sat outside as the sun went down. The air grew colder quickly, so I lit a fire in the stove inside the cabin and sat by it until I felt sleepy. That night, I woke up once. It was darker than I expected, so dark that I could not see the walls around me. I listened, and for a moment I thought I heard something moving outside, a crunch of leaves, a branch snapping, but I told myself it was probably an animal. The forest was full of them, deer, raccoons, maybe even a bear. I stayed still until I felt calm again, and then I went back to sleep. The next day, I went for a walk along a path that led into the woods. The ground was damp in places, and I could see animal tracks in the mud. I followed the trail until I reached a small stream. I sat there for a while, listening to the water and watching it move over the rocks. On my way back, I noticed something strange. Off the trail, maybe 30 feet into the trees, I saw what looked like a pile of wood. I thought it might be another cabin or maybe an old shed. Curiosity got the better of me, so I walked closer. It was not a cabin. It was just a rough shelter, built out of branches and logs leaned against each other, like a crude lean-to. It looked like someone had made it recently. The wood was not rotting, and there were pieces of rope holding parts together. On the ground inside were some empty food cans and a blanket that looked dirty and damp. Someone had been living there, or maybe still was. I felt uneasy. The cabin I was staying in was supposed to be private, far from anyone else. I had not seen another house or car for miles when I drove in. The thought that someone might be camping this close made me feel watched, though I had not seen anyone yet. Back at the cabin, I tried to push it out of my mind. I made lunch, read a book, and wrote for a while. But every so often, I thought I heard something in the trees. Could have been the wind or animals, but after finding that shelter, I could not shake the idea that it might be a person. That night, as I sat by the stove, I heard something outside again. This time I was sure of it. Footsteps, slow and careful, moving around the cabin. I froze. The sound went from one side of the cabin to the other. I did not move, I just sat there, listening. After a while, it stopped. I wanted to look out the window, but I was afraid. Eventually, I blew out the lantern and sat in the dark, waiting. I do not know how long it was before I fell asleep in the chair. The following morning, I went outside to look. Nothing seemed out of place. But when I walked around the cabin, I saw footprints in the dirt. They were not animal tracks. They were boots. Someone had been there. My first thought was to leave. I could pack up and drive back to the city. But I told myself maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was a hunter passing through or someone hiking. The shelter I found could belong to a hunter too. I tried to calm myself, but the unease stayed. That afternoon, I gathered some firewood and stacked it by the stove. As I worked, I kept looking into the trees. Several times I thought I saw movement, but when I stared, it was nothing. I told myself I was imagining things, but deep down I knew I wasn't. That night was worse. I lay in bed, awake, listening. The wind moved through the trees, and every creak of the cabin made me tense. Then I heard it again. Footsteps, very slow, circling. At one point, I heard something brush against the wall, like a hand dragging across the wood. I felt my chest tighten. I reached for the flashlight I kept by the bed and gripped it so hard my hand hurt. The footsteps stopped, but I could not sleep. I stayed awake, waiting for them to return. Hours seemed to pass before exhaustion finally pulled me under. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach turn. On the cabin door, scratched into the wood, were 3 long lines. Not words, just marks, carved deep. They had not been there before. Whoever was outside had done it while I was inside. I packed some of my things, ready to leave, but then I stopped. My car was parked in the clearing, and to get to it, I would have to go outside and load everything up. If someone was watching from the trees, they would see me. They might even follow me. The idea of driving down the narrow gravel road with someone behind me made me hesitate. Instead, I decided to stay one more night, but I would prepare. I locked the door, stacked some furniture against it, and kept a kitchen knife close. I sat by the stove, waiting for dark. When night came, I turned off the lantern early and sat in silence. I wanted to hear everything. For a while, there was nothing, just the sound of the stove ticking as it cooled. Then it started again. Footsteps, this time closer, slower. They circled the cabin again. Then I heard the sound of something tapping on the window. Just a single tap, then silence. My chest pounded so hard I thought I might faint. I sat there for what felt like hours, gripping the knife, barely breathing. Eventually, the footsteps moved away. I did not sleep at all. When the sun came up, I made my decision. I packed everything quickly, shoving it into bags without caring how. I loaded the car, scanning the trees constantly. My hands shook as I started the engine. The gravel crunched under the tires as I pulled away, and I kept looking in the mirror, expecting to see someone step out onto the road. The drive back felt endless. Every bend in the road made me think a car or a person would be waiting, but the road stayed empty. When I finally reached the highway, I felt a wave of relief so strong I almost cried. I never went back to that cabin. I never told anyone the full story either. To this day, I do not know who was out there or what they wanted. But I know this. I was not alone in those woods. Someone was watching me, coming closer each night, and if I had stayed longer, I am sure I would not have made it out. I went to the cabin because I thought it would give me some peace. I had been feeling worn down by the noise and rush of everyday life, and the thought of spending a week in the quiet woods felt like the best way to clear my head. The cabin was not mine, but I had rented it through a small listing that I found online. It looked simple, nothing fancy, just a wooden structure tucked away between tall trees with a small lake nearby. That was exactly what I wanted. I was not looking for comfort or luxury. I wanted isolation, silence, and the kind of stillness that would make me feel like I was far away from everything. When I first drove down the narrow dirt road that led to the place, I noticed how quickly the forest swallowed me. The road curved in strange ways, full of bumps, with tree branches stretching out over it, making it feel like a tunnel of green. By the time I reached the cabin, I could not see the main road anymore. It felt like I had entered another world. The cabin itself sat in a small clearing, with tall grass and wild plants growing up to the porch. The wood was dark, weathered, and there were spots where it looked soft from rain over the years. The porch had 2 old chairs and a railing that leaned slightly, as if it would give in if I pressed too hard against it. I parked my car next to the cabin and shut off the engine. The silence that followed was heavy. It was so quiet that I could hear the ticking sound of my engine cooling down. I stood there for a while, just listening. There were no cars, no people, no background noise at all, only the faint sound of leaves moving with the wind and the occasional bird call. That was what I had wanted. At that moment, it felt perfect. I carried my bags inside. The cabin smelled like old wood, a mix of dust and dampness, the kind of smell that sticks to a place when it has been closed up for a while. The inside was simple, just one main room with a kitchen in the corner, a table, and a small couch. There was a fireplace against one wall with a stack of logs next to it, though most of them looked half-rotten. A door at the back led to a small bedroom, just big enough for a bed and a dresser. Another door led to a bathroom that had an old sink, a toilet, and a shower stall with a curtain that looked stained from years of use. Everything was basic, but it was enough for me. I unpacked my food and stored it in the small refrigerator that hummed quietly in the corner. I placed my clothes in the dresser in the bedroom, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to feel settled. Once I had done that, I sat outside on the porch and looked at the trees. The sun was low, throwing long shadows through the woods. I noticed that the clearing around the cabin was not large. If I stepped past the grass, the forest closed in quickly. The trees were tall and thick, their trunks packed tightly together, with branches that blocked most of the sky. It felt like the woods pressed against the cabin from every side, leaving no room to breathe. That first evening passed quietly. I heated a can of soup, ate it while sitting at the small table inside, and then went back to the porch to watch the dark spread through the trees. Once the sun disappeared, the woods changed. The trees became shapes in the darkness, their outlines merging together. The silence grew heavier. I expected to hear crickets or frogs, but instead there was almost nothing. Just the occasional rustle, as if something moved in the grass far away. It was unsettling, but I told myself it was normal. Woods could be quiet sometimes. When I went to bed that night, I locked the front door and made sure the windows were shut. The bed creaked under my weight, and the sheets smelled faintly musty, like they had not been washed in a long time. I lay there listening to the silence. My breathing sounded louder than normal. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Every once in a while, I thought I heard something faint outside, like twigs snapping, but it could have been my imagination. Eventually, I fell asleep. The first 2 days were calm. I woke early, made coffee, and spent hours walking around the area. There was a trail that led down to the lake, and I sat by the shore watching the water ripple with the wind. I brought books with me, and I read them in the afternoons, sometimes sitting on the porch, sometimes stretched out on the couch inside. At night, I cooked simple meals and then sat in the dark listening to the woods. But by the 3rd night, I started to notice things. Small things at first. When I stepped outside to get some fresh air before bed, I saw that the grass around the edge of the clearing looked pressed down in spots, as if something had moved through it. First, I thought it was deer. That made sense. But the pressed grass was close to the porch, much closer than I expected wild animals to come. I tried not to think too much about it. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept waking up because I thought I heard something moving outside. It was faint, like the sound of footsteps in the grass, slow and careful. Every time I sat up and listened, the sound stopped. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but it kept happening. Eventually, I stayed awake longer, listening in the dark. The sound would come and go, like something circling the cabin. The next morning, I walked around the cabin to check. The grass in some places looked more pressed down, and I thought I saw faint prints, but the ground was not clear enough to be sure. It bothered me, but I still tried to explain it as deer or some other animal. I went about my day, though I noticed myself glancing at the tree line more often. The woods no longer felt calm. They felt like they were watching me. That evening, as the sun went down, I noticed a mark on one of the trees near the cabin. It looked like a piece of bark had been stripped off, leaving a pale patch underneath. At first, I thought it was natural, but when I looked closer, it seemed more deliberate, as if someone had taken a knife and cut into the tree. The mark was about chest high, straight, and sharp. I felt uneasy looking at it. I told myself it was nothing, maybe just a hunter marking a trail, but it did not feel right. That night was worse than the ones before. I could not sleep at all. I lay in bed listening to the sounds outside. This time, the footsteps were clearer. They moved slowly around the cabin, circling it. Sometimes they stopped for long moments, then started again. I held my breath, listening. I wanted to tell myself it was an animal, but animals do not walk in circles around a cabin in the middle of the night. My heart pounded as I listened. I wanted to get up and look out the window, but I was too afraid to see what might be there. I stayed frozen until the sounds faded away. In the morning, I checked again. The ground near the porch looked more disturbed. There were marks that looked like footprints, though they were faint. They did not look like animal tracks. They looked more like the shape of a boot pressed into the dirt. I felt a wave of fear that I tried to push down. If someone was coming near the cabin at night, what did they want? Why would they circle it instead of knocking or showing themselves? I kept myself busy that day, but I could not relax. Every sound in the woods made me jump. The trees no longer looked calm and beautiful. They looked like walls that hid someone from view. I stopped reading and just sat with my back against the wall of the cabin, watching the clearing, waiting. My stomach felt tight the whole day. I did not want to stay another night, but leaving meant driving the dirt road in the dark, and I was not sure I could do it safely. When night came, I locked the door and sat on the couch instead of going to bed. I kept a flashlight in my hand and a kitchen knife on the table next to me. The cabin felt too quiet. I listened for any sound, my ears straining. Hours passed, and nothing happened. Then, sometime after midnight, I heard it again. Slow footsteps in the grass, moving around the cabin. My chest tightened as I listened. The steps were closer this time. They came right up to the porch. I stared at the front door, every muscle in my body tense. The sound of wood creaking reached me, as if someone stepped onto the porch itself. I could hear it clearly, the weight of a foot pressing down on the old boards. I froze, gripping the flashlight and knife. The steps moved slowly across the porch, right in front of the door, and then stopped. I sat there, not moving, hardly breathing, waiting for something to happen. The silence that followed was worse than the footsteps. It stretched on, my mind racing with thoughts of someone standing just on the other side of the door. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Then, finally, the steps moved again, slowly crossing the porch and fading away into the grass. When morning came, I went outside to check. The porch had marks on it now, clear footprints in the dust and dirt that had collected on the boards. They were the prints of boots, not animals. Someone had been standing there. Someone had come in the night and walked across the porch, right up to the door. Fear settled deep in my stomach. This was not just my imagination. Someone was out there, watching the cabin, circling it, coming closer each night. I thought about leaving right then, packing my things and driving away. But part of me was afraid that whoever it was might be waiting on the road. I did not know what to do. The rest of the day, I barely moved from the cabin. I kept the doors locked and the curtains shut. I checked the windows often, but the trees looked the same, silent and unmoving. Still, I felt I had been wanting a quiet place away from the noise of the city for a long time. When a friend told me about an old cabin he rarely used up in the hills, I decided it was the perfect chance to spend a few nights alone. I drove out there on a Thursday afternoon with a trunk full of supplies. The ride was long, and the narrow roads that wound up into the woods were rough. The deeper I went, the less I saw of other people. No houses, no traffic, just trees, rocks, and dirt roads that seemed like they hadn't been maintained in years. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was starting to drop lower. The cabin was small, made of dark wood, with a rusty tin roof and a porch that leaned a little to one side. The windows were dusty and the door stuck when I first pushed it open. Inside, it smelled faintly of old wood and mildew, but it wasn't terrible. There was a small kitchen, one bedroom, and a living area with a fireplace that hadn't been used in years. The furniture was basic: a couch with sagging cushions, a wooden table, and a couple of chairs. I carried in my supplies: cans of food, a lantern, water, some tools, a hatchet, and a sleeping bag just in case the bed wasn't comfortable. After setting things up, I stepped back outside. The woods around the cabin were thick. The trees stretched high, and the undergrowth was dense. I could hear nothing but the faint breeze through the leaves and the occasional cry of a bird. It was peaceful in one way, but there was something about the silence that felt heavier than I expected. I spent the first evening exploring a bit around the cabin. There was a narrow trail that led down to a small creek, and the water there was clear and cold. I followed the creek for a while but turned back before it got too dark. When I returned, I lit a lantern, opened a can of beans, and ate at the small table. The sound of the woods outside was strange. I wasn't used to hearing only the noises of nature. Every snap of a branch or rustle in the brush carried a weight that made me stop and listen. That night I tried to sleep in the bed, but it creaked every time I moved. The mattress was thin and smelled faintly of dust. Lying there in the dark, I noticed how black it was outside. No streetlights, no glow from houses, not even the moon at first. The silence was deep, broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl or some small animal moving outside. I kept drifting in and out of shallow sleep, waking up to the sound of my own breath or the creak of the wooden walls shifting with the night air. The next day, I decided to hike further. I wanted to get a sense of the area, maybe even mark some paths so I wouldn't get lost. I took a small backpack with water, a snack, and my hatchet. The woods were thick but beautiful. The ground was covered in pine needles, and the air smelled sharp and fresh. As I moved deeper, the sounds of the world grew more distant. It was just the crunch of my boots and the occasional bird call. At one point, I thought I heard something behind me, like a faint movement in the brush. I stopped and turned, but there was nothing. I told myself it was just a squirrel or maybe a deer, but the sound had been heavier than that. I shrugged it off and kept walking. By the afternoon, I had looped back toward the cabin. I made a small fire outside and cooked a bit of food over it. The smell of smoke and cooking meat was comforting, but at the same time, I realized how much it carried. Out here, there was no noise to cover scents or sounds. If there was anything out there, it would know exactly where I was. That night was worse than the first. I tried to sleep, but I kept waking up. At one point, I was sure I heard footsteps outside the cabin. Slow, careful steps on the porch. I froze in bed, barely breathing. The sound lasted only a few seconds before it stopped, but it was enough to set my nerves on fire. I waited, listening hard, but there was nothing else. Eventually, I told myself it must have been the wood shifting, though deep down I didn't believe it. The following day, I tried to shake it off. I went down to the creek again, filled some bottles with water, and sat there for a while. The cold air felt good, but as I sat on the bank, I noticed footprints in the mud. They weren't mine. They were fresh too. They looked like boot prints, and they came down from the direction of the woods on the other side of the creek. I stared at them for a long time, trying to make sense of it. The cabin was supposed to be in a pretty remote area, far from any main trail. Whoever it was had been close, maybe even watching me. When I got back to the cabin, I checked the ground around it. At first, I didn't see much, but then, near the edge of the porch, I noticed a faint print in the dirt. The shape of a boot sole, just one, half faded into the ground. I felt a chill run through me. That night, when I thought I'd heard steps, maybe I really had. I locked the door that evening, even though it was just a simple wooden latch. I put my supplies closer to me and kept the hatchet next to the bed. The hours crawled by. At one point in the night, I heard movement again. Not right on the porch this time, but nearby in the woods. It was faint, but steady, like someone walking slowly around. I sat up, holding the hatchet, my heart hammering. After what felt like forever, the sound faded. The next morning, I felt drained, but I tried to think logically. Maybe it was just hunters or someone passing through. Still, something didn't feel right. I decided to cut my trip short and leave the next day. I packed some things early and kept the rest ready. That day, I stayed closer to the cabin, chopping some wood and trying to keep busy. The more I looked at the tree line, the more uneasy I felt. It was like something was just out of sight, watching. In the late afternoon, I found something that shook me worse than anything else. Behind the cabin, near the trees, I noticed a pile of cigarette butts on the ground. They weren't old. Some still had bits of tobacco that looked fresh. I hadn't smoked a single one. Whoever had been around here had been close enough to sit and smoke behind the cabin, maybe even while I was inside. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the living area with the lantern low, the hatchet in my hand, and my ears straining at every sound. Around midnight, I heard it again. Slow footsteps coming up onto the porch. The boards creaked under the weight. I held my breath, staring at the door. The latch rattled lightly, like someone testing it. My grip tightened on the hatchet. After a moment, the sound stopped. Then silence. I waited for what felt like hours before I moved. My whole body ached from sitting still, every muscle tense. Eventually, the sky began to lighten, and I felt a wave of relief that I had made it through the night. When the sun was up, I decided I wasn't waiting anymore. I grabbed everything I could, stuffed it into the car, and started driving down the narrow dirt road. The cabin faded behind me as the trees closed in. My hands gripped the wheel tight, my eyes flicking to the mirrors again and again. A few miles down, I noticed something in the mud on the side of the road. Fresh tire tracks. They were wide, from a truck or SUV, and they hadn't been there when I came up. They led in the direction of the cabin. Someone else had been up there, maybe even still nearby when I left. By the time I reached the main road, I felt a weight lift. But even as I drove back toward the city, I couldn't shake the thought of those nights. The steps on the porch, the cigarette butts, the footprints by the creek. Someone had been watching me, maybe waiting for the right moment. I was lucky I left when I did. I never went back to that cabin. I told my friend it wasn't for me, that I preferred the noise of the city after all. But sometimes at night, when I wake up in the dark, I think about how quiet it was out there and how close those footsteps had been.